Okay, so, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of the school. Okay, so congratulations to you for being here on a Saturday at 9 a.m. after Friday in Lisbon, last day of a busy week. I don't know, you are great and you still want more, right? So you deserve congratulations. If you have a colleague next to you, perhaps give him a high five because he deserves it. So, this lecture is going to be about vision and language. Now, my name is not Desmond Elliott. I think on the website you see Desmond presenting this talk. So I'm not Desmond. I'm not a professor at the University of Copenhagen. Desmond is actually here in front. So he had a small accident. For him, teaching a long lecture would still be a bit hard, so we decided to split. Okay, so my name is actually Bruno. I'm a professor here in Técnico. I've collaborated with him before. I'm glad to do this as well. And again, in the coffee break, okay, so if you see Desmond, give him a hug. He deserves it as well. Okay? So some logistics before we start the talk. So these slides, I guess for some of you, it will be useful to try to take notes. So if you have there a QR code, you can download the slides, do whatever you want, take notes, that's fine. And another thing is that I think by the middle of this lecture, you'll receive instructions on Discord or via email for a questionnaire that will allow you to give feedback to the school organizers about, well, the school. So in the afternoon, in the coffee break when you can, please try to fill in that questionnaire. For us, it's important to know how you feel, what you think could be improved for us to start preparing the next lecture or the next edition. So let's see. I guess we can start with definition for vision and language learning, vision and language models. Okay, so we can say that this is a sort of special case of a multimodal multimodal learning, in which the idea is to jointly process inputs from two or more distinct modalities. So this can be images and text, or videos and audio, or audio and text. There are lots of possible combinations. The general idea is that you take large amounts of data in different modalities. Okay, so this data can be paired. You may have, for instance, images and corresponding text descriptions, or you may have different modalities paired to a target output. You provide this to a large neural network, you train this model, and hopefully by the end, you'll get something that is able to provide useful outputs for multimodal inputs. That's the general idea. Okay. Now, why is this interesting? Why should we care about this? What benefits may we get from doing something like this? Well, on the one hand, there are, for instance, studies pointing to, let's say, a biological motivation for doing something like this. Okay. There are different studies that point, for instance, to the fact that multimodal inputs actually are processed in similar ways in human brains. Okay? So the image that you see here in this slide comes from a study, it's actually referenced here, by Friedman, Purvelmuller and colleagues. And what they did was that they attempted to see how humans process perception inputs, right? So humans were exposed to tasks that involved movements in the feet, movements in the figures, movements in the tongue. They tried to see which regions of the brain are more active when processing these types of inputs. And then the same people were exposed to stimuli that corresponded to textual descriptions for these body parts as well. And similar regions of the brain end up being activated from these different modalities as well. Okay, which motivates this idea that there's some sort of shared processing and some benefit in doing shared processing of multimodal information. Another motivating example concerns the fact that grounding language in vision, for instance, multimodal grounding can help to reduce ambiguity. Okay? So this slide here has a sentence that I believe can be interpreted in a given way, but that is highly ambiguous. Okay? So do you have any idea of what this sentence can mean? There are multiple possible interpretations, okay? And if you see something like this in a public space, or if you imagine that an alien creature or a robot from the 80s that doesn't actually have any physical but sees something like this, well, different interpretations for this sentence are possible. But with additional visual information, perhaps this can become a bit clearer. Okay? And by looking at the full picture, analyzing this multimodal information besides just the textual sentence, it becomes clearer the meaning, the intended meaning for that expression. Okay? So you saw some talks and some presentations here that tackled this issue. There's actually this position paper before that argued for limitations in learning from language alone. Okay, and sure, there's this idea that learning can actually be made richer from additional context. Okay, so in the beginning, NLP mostly relied on small controlled corpora. I guess nowadays, language models basically learn from huge amounts of textual information from the internet. Okay? But there are still limitations in that. One argument is that, for instance, it can be very, very hard to understand meaning from radio shows, okay, from language on the radio, without grounding, without perception. Okay, from the audio alone, you'll get some information, but you won't be able to perceive as much as you would get, for instance, from accompanying visual data as well. Okay, you'll see names for objects, but you won't see their properties as clearly. Now, on another level, maybe from television, for instance, you can learn more, but again, there are still limitations. Okay, so from something like a TV show, you are able to see how objects interact. You're able to perceive properties associated with objects, but you're still, for instance, limited in terms of interacting with objects, in terms of seeing what actions you can perform over the objects and what are the effects of these actions. So by lacking embodiment, you are still also limited in the types of things that you can learn. And yet on another level, you can think that there's a social aspect to learning as well. Okay? And without interacting with others, without these social contacts, you're also limited in terms of what you can learn. Okay? So I would say that nowadays, most state-of-the-art systems still do most of the learning from corpora, from the internet. There's actually a lot that you can learn from language alone. But it's also clear that, sure, limitations exist. And nowadays, the field and the area is moving towards integrating these other dimensions as well. So back in 2018, there was this survey on vision and language learning and multimodal learning that kind of presented 5 major research areas or sub-areas connected with this. I think this is still relevant, even though the field has broadened today, and most of these, or all of these 5 areas that are listed here, mostly concern tasks, mostly concern things that you can do with models. Okay. Nowadays, research has expanded. It includes things such as evaluating these models and concerns with that. It concerns understanding how these models work, understanding how these models scale. So there are other research challenges beyond this. This talk here this morning is also going to tackle on some of these other challenges. But these 5 areas, I think they're still meaningful. Okay? And it's still a good taxonomy, let's say, for you to understand the types of problems and tasks that people are concerned with when thinking about vision and language. Okay? And these are essentially as follows. So on the one hand, we have issues concerning with representation, right? How do you design computational representations from multimodal data that are useful for downstream tasks? How do you represent this data? Translation. So how do you convert data in one modality to another? Alignment. Okay, it's similar to representation, but in this case it concerns how do you produce representations from multimodal data that are aligned. Okay, representations that allow you to take, for instance, queries in one modality and return results on the other. Then there's fusion. Okay, in some cases you want to perform tasks that involve a combination of multiple modalities. How do you combine representations from multiple modalities? And co-learning. Okay, co-learning concerns this idea that by considering data in one modality, maybe you can learn better representations and perform tasks better for data in other modalities as well. Okay, so you learn to perform things in one modality by simultaneously using data from other modalities as well. Okay. So in terms of representation, we'll see this in more detail during the lecture, but there's a lot of previous work on this. Okay, so we talked here in the school also about representations for text. Okay? And in the early days, these were mostly based on heuristics, like you represented text, for instance, as vectors in which the dimensions correspond to entries from a vocabulary, and you use term frequency to represent documents. Okay? For images, it's similar. Early methods also used this sort of heuristics. Okay? People used representations, for instance, based on histograms of directions or histograms of colors present on the images. Okay? With the increasing adoption of neural networks and neural networks to create representations, nowadays this is also what is more commonly used. Okay? So there are models like CLIP or Dino that essentially explore huge amounts of data with pretext tasks and self-training objectives that allow you to create good representations for image data. In one case, representations, let's say, that are a bit more global and that capture global properties of images, CLIP. In the other case, representations that are more fine-grained, that focus a bit more on specific details and that support tasks that concern analyzing details on images, like Dino. In terms of translation, again, there's a huge amount of work on this. Just send this. So yeah, back in the 2010s, there was seminal work that proposed this idea of using encoder-decoder models for doing translation, for instance, from images to sentences, to descriptions, to text. The idea is that you can take an image encoder model, like a convolutional neural network, to create representations. And then you can use a language model, for instance, in the days, a recurrent neural network to generate text conditioned on the image representations. Okay? A lot of work followed on this general idea. More recently, you also saw work that approached translation in the different direction, from text to generating images, for instance, in connection with diffusion models and things like this. In terms of alignment, this is very important for doing self-supervised learning, for creating representations. It's also useful in support of tasks that concern bridging modalities, tasks like cross-modal retrieval. The idea is that you have a query in one modality, for instance, a textual description, and you're supposed to return from a database all the objects, all the images that match that textual description. Okay? So the idea here is to create representations that are aligned. From representation of some object in one modality, you can make comparisons, you can estimate distances, and you can establish relationships towards representations for objects in another modality. So a seminal work on this was Clipped, as I just mentioned. Okay, so this was a model that introduced this idea of contrastive learning to learn cross-modal representations. Okay, so this was a model that was trained to represent images and texts in a shared embedding space under this property that images and texts that share some resemblance, that match, should have a low distance, a high similarity in this embedding space, and objects that don't match should be the opposite, right? Should be further away in this space. So the figure that you have here to your left is an extension of this idea from CLIP actually applied to videos and to sequences of images in which the idea of images that are nearby, you can consider these as well as other positive examples. Alignment also relates to more fine-grained tasks in which the alignment is supposed to be made, for instance, between texts and specific parts of images. Okay, so you're supposed to match particular image regions and the representations for these regions to textual expressions for tasks such as referring expression segmentation, object detection, and things like this. Fusion, as I said, concerns this idea of combining representations and objects from different modalities in order to solve tasks. Early work in the area explored either early fusion methods, in which the idea is for you to have shared or a single unified model that processes the representations from the different modalities, okay, processes low-level representations from the different modalities early on. You also had late fusion methods, in which you kind of had separate models to produce representations specific to each modality, and then in the end you combine these representations for a given task. I would argue that nowadays things are more mixed, and current architectures mostly use attention or other neural network components in order to fuse the different modalities in different layers of a given model. Okay? So there are, for instance, models in which in some of the layers, if you have inputs that correspond to images and text, then you use attention to mix the modalities. You can, for instance, do something like have queries correspond to the image tokens, have keys and values correspond to the text tokens, and so you have the visual contents attending to the text or the other way around and mixing this. Or you can have networks in which attention is made in a shared way with a single attention layer for processing together the different modalities, and then the other components of the network, like multi-layer perceptrons that are involved in this layer, are specialized for layer. So nowadays things are a bit more mixed, and this idea of fusing different modalities happens within models, within different layers of models. Some of this is going to be tackled later on the lecture as well. And finally, co-learning is, for instance, important in the context of zero-shot transfer across modalities. So the idea here is to leverage learning from different modalities in order to better solve tasks in a given modality. And this can be from learning more or a better image representation model from text as well, or learning a better text representation model from images as well. The two studies that are cited here correspond to these two different ideas. And the idea is that the information in one modality can complement what is available on the other. Okay? Think, for instance, of a model like BERT for learning to represent text. You can learn a model like this from huge amounts of textual data, but textual data is perhaps going to be limited in terms of how different objects are described. You need a lot of text to capture information that is likely, for instance, more easily captured through images. So when learning text representations, you can try to learn good embeddings for, let's say, individual words, that are also good at predicting image properties. So you can mix image data when trying to learn a model that represents text, for instance. Okay. Co-learning explores these types of ideas. So this lecture here is going to be talking about tasks. It's going to be covering these, let's say, taxonomy that I just described, but also other things. And we're going to be following, let's say, a general structure that kind of corresponds to how vision and language models or modern vision and language models are built and are used nowadays. Okay? So on the one hand, you have data, for instance, images paired with texts, and you are going to use these data to learn a vision language model that simultaneously processes these modalities for different applications. Now, within this vision language model, typically, there is a part that concerns representing images. Okay. There is a part that concerns a bridge between this vision encoder and the language model. Now, this connector can be made in lots of different ways, and I think in the second part here of the lecture, you're going to be seeing this in a bit more detail. Okay. So you can have connectors that correspond to, let's say, components or adaptation layers placed in between the different layers of a transformer language model. Or you can have a connector that is simply a linear projection from the image representations into the embeddings of the language model. Okay, so that there are different options in order to design this. And so finally, once you have built a system like this that connects an encoder for a modality like vision with a language model, you can apply this to some task. Okay. So this lecture here is going to follow more or less this structure. And the lecture is also divided in different parts. Okay, so here in this first part, we'll first be talking about data sets and data. Okay, the data sets that can support different tasks and that people usually consider for training and evaluating these models. What challenges go into building and collecting these data sets? Then we're going to be talking about data representation with a focus on vision, right? So how do you represent visual data targeting this idea that later on we're going to be connecting this to a language model? We're going to be diving in a bit more detail into the techniques that concern building these vision and language models, the connectors that can be used. Okay. We're going to talk a bit about understanding how these connectors work, how these vision and language models actually process information. And finally, we're going to talk about future directions and research ahead. Okay. All of these, in most cases, is going to be made by recurring also to examples of research that illustrates these points and that showcases different aspects that should be considered in connection to these different parts. Okay. So any questions as of now? Anything that you would like me to try to clarify? Okay, so I think we can move on. So there's this social media post by Jack Morris, okay, that makes these arguments that most real breakthroughs, most real advances in AI recently are actually not really connected to technical developments, but to more data, specifically to access to different sources of data. Whenever researchers got the idea of accessing a different source of data in order to build models, a huge advancement took place. Okay, and this happened, for instance, on computer vision with AlexNet, when people thought about learning neural networks at scale from image data. It happened with language models, with this idea of using massive data from the web to learn language. It happened with this idea of accessing instructions and reinforcement learning in order to learn models that are able to follow instructions. So the claim is that, sure, there are technical developments, but the major breakthroughs, these technical developments were mostly small increments, small deltas in performance. The major breakthroughs came from data. And so data is not something that should be minimized, okay? It's not something that we use at the end after some research has been made. No, data is fundamental from the beginning. Now, I'm not sure if I fully agree with this claim, but yeah, good storytellers, I guess, exaggerate these things in order to make a point and go, well, I'm going to go with this as well in order to illustrate the point as well. Okay, so basically I'm going to talk about data sets, data in vision language models, and I'm going to try to categorize data sets according to different dimensions. Okay, and see what are the main aspects that influence data creation and its usage in connection to these different dimensions. Okay. So on the one hand, for building these models, there are two, let's say, basic types of resources. Okay. So on the one hand, we may have data sets that are mined from existing sources from the web, usually at scale. Okay. Not necessarily so, but sure, this basic type is more connected with that. Okay. On the other hand, you have data sets that are created from scratch, in most cases smaller, more curated, carefully designed for a given purpose. Okay. Further expanding on this, you can think that there are, let's say, 4 different stereotypes for people that create these data sets, projects that develop these data sets. Okay, you may, if you, in case you had previous experience on these, if you were involved in projects that had to do data set creation, maybe you see a bit of yourself in these stereotypes, okay? Or you can recognize these in existing projects and in data sets that you used, okay? But this is, of course, let's say, a simplification, right? So, of course, real data sets are often a blend and a mixture of these different things. So on the one hand, you have that little guy there. You have the data miner. This corresponds to projects that essentially do large-scale data extraction from the web. So you care about size. And often through size, you get a lot of interesting properties as well. You get coverage of different things, okay, and problems. On the other hand, you have this idea of a specialized detector, okay, the detectorist. So in this case, these people and these projects concern still about real artifacts, but rare cases. Okay? Data that is highly curated for a given purpose, that involves carefully selecting from a huge pool those examples that are really, really interesting for a given purpose. Okay? There's also the permaculturist or the gardener, let's say. So these are the projects that concern mostly about preserving what exists in nature, minimal interventions. These data sets can vary in size, actually. They can be built, they can be collected. But the main idea here is that as much as possible, the effort is on preserving the natural distribution of phenomena in the data. Okay. And finally, you have the Baroque, okay, let's say the opera set designer, okay. So if you have an extra day, go to Sintra, you'll see a lot of this. The idea here is still to preserve some connection to reality, but often in an exaggerated way. So these data sets take a huge effort to build. They typically focus on getting the hard cases, the really, really difficult, extreme scenarios that would be very hard to get if you were collecting real data, and that you need to design very carefully in order to pick, in order to choose complex phenomena. Right? So these are highly designed data sets built for a specific purpose, not really reflecting reality, but instead focusing more on really challenging cases. Now, of course, these are stereotypes, these are simplifications. Most data sets are actually a blend of something like this. I can try to give some examples, and later on I'm going to present some examples in more detail. Okay, so you can think, for instance, of data sets pairing images to textual descriptions, very large in size, that mostly support the pre-training of these vision and language models. On the one hand, you can think of these more related to the data miner stereotype, huge data sets collected from the web. But in reality, what people use nowadays usually involves more than that. Okay, so these data sets are actually built initially from crawling the web, but then people repurpose the descriptions that they encounter on the web, they filter them, they rephrase the descriptions. In the extreme case, they use language models to rewrite the descriptions. And so it's not really just data collection, okay, it involves refinement. So it's a blend of these things. Okay. So I can think also of a project here in Technical in which I was involved, in which we built a data set that focused on these, let's say, spot the differences puzzles. So you have a pair of images, one is slightly different from the other, and the idea is to describe the differences that exist between these two images. So on the one hand, this was very detectorist, right? So the student was looking for examples on the web that really fit this description. The images are supposed to be natural. He needed to, in many cases, rewrite the descriptions of the differences. And he also then created artificial data on top of that. So there was a blend of techniques in order to build a data set like this. Okay? So real projects are like that they blend these different stereotypes. Anyway, besides these stereotypes, there are also different factors that you should consider and that affect how data is gathered, collected, created, and that influence the types of things that you can measure and that you can do afterward with these data sets. Okay? So we are going to be seeing this in detail, connecting these factors also to the different stereotypes that I saw. On the one hand, there's this idea of scope, right? What type of data are you aiming to collect? There are issues in terms of your relationship with the people that provide you the data. That has influences on the results as well. There are issues related to what type of images you are collecting, what types of texts you are collecting. These two often are related. Okay, so what was their original purpose, for instance, and what you aim to do with this data. And then there's the image of binding or compatibility, let's say. How much the two modalities are represented in the same way or represent the same information, let's say, versus representing through different modalities, different aspects of the same object. Okay. These things, these factors influence a lot how you collect data and also what you can do with it. So I'm going to illustrate these different factors and the different stereotypes through data sets and projects in which Desmond was specifically involved. Okay, so 4 use cases, let's say. On the one hand, we'll see multi-30K. Okay, so this was a data set for image captioning beyond English, okay, for German English captioning. The idea was initially images were collected from an existing platform on the web. These images or this data set existed, it featured captions in English, and the project concerned trying to replicate what existed in English for a different language, in that case, German. Marvel was different, okay? So it was a project focused on collecting data that attempted to go beyond the concepts and the things that are typically featured on images collected from a Western, let's say, European, North American perspective, trying to go towards other languages and other cultures as well. Food EQA was very specific, so it's a data set for multi-choice question answering, focused on a very, very detailed aspect, okay? So in this case, Chinese cuisine. And Kaleidoscope was a data set that focused on question answering as well, but in this case here, the topic was exams, typically feature questions that you see typically featured in exams, but covering also multiple languages and multiple disciplines and multiple cultures. Okay, so these different data sets, we're going to be seeing them in detail. They kind of illustrate different aspects associated with data collection, different stereotypes that we described as well. Okay, and we're going to be using these use cases to illustrate some points. First of all, in terms of scope, oops, let me see here. Okay. So scope concerns what type of data you're actually trying to collect. Okay, you can categorize scope, for instance, in terms of having data that is, let's say, more broad in terms of its coverage of different scopes, or more focused on a specific and narrow domain. Okay, so you have different types of data sets that approach this problem differently. On the one hand, very large data sets of data collected from the web, like Lion, they attempt to have a very broad coverage. On the other hand, FoodEQA, Marvel are examples of data sets focused on specific cultures, specific aspects of culture, specific domains. Depending on the scope of the data that you collect, okay, so you can approach different tasks as well, or in many cases, the type of data that you have access to can also allow you and support the development of models capable of approaching different tasks. Okay, so on the one hand, you may have data that is useful for tasks that involve generating sequences or generating images in some case. So these translation tasks, these concerns things like describing images, captioning, assigning classes to images with basis on similarity between textual descriptions and the image contents, doing multiple choice question answering from a given image plus a question, attempt to figure out what is the correct answer for that question, doing image generation and so forth. Okay. So for these, you need images paired with descriptions. On the other hand, you may have tasks that concern classifying multimodal inputs. Okay, so from a given image and the text, assign a class. This can, for instance, be visual question answering, right? You can see the answer as a sort of class, and your aim is to figure out the correct answer from a given multimodal input. And you have tasks that instead concern doing retrieval, doing alignment, okay? So assessing relations between objects in different modalities, okay? So these are tasks, for instance, like given an image as input or a text description as input, discover in a given database what are other texts or other images that relate to this input. Either that or more fine-grained, and in a fine-grained way, attempt to localize, for instance, in images, where are the objects that concern particular textual descriptions. Okay. So concrete examples. In multi-30K, as I said, the main objective was to replicate an existing data set. Okay. In that case, Flickr 30K. So the data set actually concerns textual descriptions for approximately 30,000 images collected from a web platform. In this project, what people attempted to do was to see how people from a different country, a different culture, using a different language, would also describe images. See also if models that can do this very efficiently in English also generalize and using similar techniques, if we could do this equally well for other languages as well. Okay. So this data set was built through crowdsourcing. Okay. So it involved hiring people to perform the description of existing images with this aim of replicating a procedure and the same thing that existed before for the original English data set. Marvel, on the other hand, instead of replicating, focused on something new. Okay, so the idea here was to go beyond what existed. Okay, so most data sets used in computer vision, for instance, they focus on classes that are typical of, let's say, a more Western, European, North American view. Okay, so classes in images or from the data sets in which images are collected are, for instance, derived from taxonomies like WordNet. Okay, and images collected by people from different cultures maybe focus instead on different things. Maybe they focus on concepts and objects that are not so common in the Western world. Maybe the types of concerns, the types of descriptions, the types of aspects that people present when describing these images are different as well. Okay. So Marvel was created with this purpose. So the data set was built with this idea of having pairs of images and questions, comparing what is interesting and what is present or absent from a given image and not the other. And systems were tasked with reasoning about the contents of the images in order to reflect the presence of these concepts that are culture specific. Foodie QA is another example, more baroque, more specialized, in this case tackling a more niche domain, okay? Chinese cuisine. Again, even though some models and some data sets existed that focused on this domain, the perspective was mostly Western-centric, okay? Chinese cuisine can be a very, very fine-grained topic with very precise distinctions between different classes. And so the idea in this project was to collect a data set that could support, again, question answering tasks from images that reflect this specific culture and the specific fine-grained domain, with question types that concern these concepts and these classes that are present in this domain. And you're going to be seeing this a bit later on, also featuring images that are not so frequent on the web, images that are likely not seen by previously existing models. Finally, Kaleidoscope, focused on exams. Okay, so there are other similar data sets, more English-centric. Again, here the idea was to cover questions concerning different types of visual data. In some cases, diagrams, in some cases, illustrations, in some cases, photos. And questions in different languages focused on contents from different disciplines, different cultures as well. So all these data sets illustrate different purposes, different scopes of data that one can attempt to collect in order to build these models. In terms of existing relationships between the annotators and the people that then are going to be using this data, there are different possibilities as well. These may appear more unrelated, let's say, to the objectives of researchers and users of vision language models, but in reality, aspects like these, the motivation behind the data collection, the relationship between the people that are later on using this data and the people that provide it, can actually influence results a lot, and it can be very important as well. Okay. So in terms of classifying these possible relationships, here in this slide you'll see 4 classes. Again, in some cases this is a blend. But on the one hand, you have data sets in which you hired people specifically for doing these tasks. Okay. In some cases, these people that are hired are experts. In some cases, these people are hired through crowdsourcing platforms. Okay. There is some debate on whether or not, let's say, the motivations, the willingness of these people to give you good quality data, or how much this influences results. Okay. Or there are aspects to consider in terms of this. When people are hired, where people are not invested in the task and in the data that they are providing, what type of effect this has on the data. Okay. Then on the other hand, you have data collected from volunteers or data collected from collaborators. Collaborators, I would say it's a bit even stronger than volunteers. The main idea here is that people are, in this case, more invested in the data, more interested in the data collection process, more interested in the possible uses that the data may have. Okay. So Kaleidoscope is an example of this. It's more towards collaborators because the data and these exams were actually collected from scholars in different fields, but people were given an extra incentive in the sense that if they provided up to a given amount of data, they would be invited to be collaborators in the final study. And finally, there are cases in which, let's say, there's not really a relationship between the people providing the data and the people that later on are going to use it. This happens, for instance, in the case of data projects that involve collection from the web. Okay. In this case, let's say the direction is or the relationship is indirect. So multi-30K, it's actually an interesting example. Desmond was involved in this project. Okay, so as I said, crowd workers were hired in order to perform annotations of images in German. Okay, and an interesting thing is that, well, when collecting data like this, the people may have different motivations for giving you the data, for participating in this project. Okay, unexpected things may happen in terms of how the annotations were actually produced, what types of challenges were involved, what people thought about the data collection process. Okay. So in this specific project, one thing that happened is that the crowd workers that were performing the task, they had a, let's say, a platform similar to Discord in order to discuss what they were doing. And Desmond was able to see what people were discussing in this platform. Okay? He didn't intervene, so there were no comments from the organizers in that platform. But it was interesting to see the types of things that people were thinking about and people were considering when performing the annotation task. And some of these things are really interesting. So, for instance, people are going to be performing these tasks with different levels of attention. For some people, the effort, let's say, that is involved or that people put into this task is going to be difficult or different, sorry. And for instance, in these discussions, you can find things that concern, for instance, people discussing their strategies to manage the task. Okay, so people saying things like, I can only do a couple of images before taking a break. This is too boring. After annotating a couple of images, I need to take a break and I can only do it like this. Okay. Or you can even find discussions of people telling that the task actually affected them a lot and their life beyond work a lot. Okay, so there's someone saying that after performing the task later on, when cooking dinner and when looking at the dishes and the oven and things like this, people were thinking still in the zone of doing annotations, and as they were performing these other tasks from their daily life, they were thinking about doing annotations for images, right? Which is kind of sad, but these things affect people in different ways. And you also see in some cases speculations about how the data is going to be used. Who are the people collecting this data? What's their purpose? Okay, is it some AI company that is later on going to be using this data that I'm providing? Or is it some shady CIA experiment starting to understand how people annotate images? So all sorts of unexpected things may happen. Be prepared when doing large-scale data collection, for instance, by hiring people with these crowdsourcing platforms to have unexpected things in the data that you collect and to have unexpected effects associated with this data collection process. On the other hand, Kaleidoscope is a project that instead took this approach of being more based on volunteers and collaborators. Okay, so in this case here, let's say incentives for people to participate are very different. And the type of data and annotations and things that you get from a data collection process like this is very different. A third aspect, okay, so what types of images do you get in your data? From which sources do you collect them? What other aspects are interesting here? So again, different projects take different approaches and collect data from different types. So for instance, in some cases, you may have data that is mostly natural photos taken outside. In some cases, this visual data is not photos, it's instead images of documents or diagrams or sketches or graphs, different types of things. In terms of, let's say, sources, you can have data that is carefully curated or private data that was provided and collected for a specific purpose only, or data that is instead scraped from the web. In terms of data scraped from the web, and not only, there are important issues to consider in terms of licensing and rights associated to the usage of these images. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about this later on, but even if things are put on the web, does this mean that people were aware of the types of usage that this image data is going to have later on? And you should also be concerned about what you are doing when developing projects like this in terms of protecting private information, personally identifiable information, right? So this is very, very challenging. Making sure that people are not identifiable from data that you then feature on your projects is very, very hard. But people should take measures in this direction should make this a concern and should do the best that they can in terms of anonymizing people in these images. So Food EQA is an interesting project in this regard, okay? Because it was very targeted. Okay? It aimed at collecting images from a very specific domain. And one interesting thing that the project considered was the fact that when providing images to the project through data collection, people were not only supposed to classify the types of images that they were providing, for instance, selecting the type of cuisine that was represented there, but they were supposed to only say and guarantee that the photo that they were providing was not previously uploaded on the web. Okay, so this was a photo that apparently, or ideally, no model should have seen before. Okay. And by collecting data like this, some interesting experiments and interesting data can be collected later on. So the authors of the dataset later on tried to check whether or not the performance of different vision language models in solving these question answering tasks was affected by whether or not the images were private images, okay, that models likely or for sure hadn't seen before, versus very similar images that depicted the same concepts that were previously uploaded on the web and that perhaps models might have seen before. And the differences are very significant. Okay? Performance is much worse on this private subset of the data, okay, with images that haven't been seen before. Again, so this was in terms of the source. In terms of, let's say, the type of image, often you see also that there are different types that can be considered, and model performance can also vary significantly across image types. Okay, again, in this kaleidoscope project, so questions from exams were paired with image contextual information. Different types of images were considered. In some cases, these were maps or photos or diagrams or charts or equations. And depending on the type of image being considered, again, performance can vary very significantly. Okay? It's, for instance, much more challenged to handle diagrams than, for instance, natural photos. So similarly to images, there's also the issue of text, right? What types of textual data you are getting and you are collecting, okay? Where are you getting this data from and which topics and languages you're supposed to be covering? Again, different projects take different approaches to this, okay? On the one hand, in terms of the type of text, this can be, for instance, questions concerning image contents, okay? Or you can for instance, consider collecting descriptions for images, sentences, or longer pieces of text that describe images. In terms of the source of data, this can be naturally provided. Okay, they can be provided by humans, descriptions provided by humans for given images. They can be generated automatically. Okay, for instance, from templates that produce a sort of, language, but with particular regularities. Okay. Or they can be crowdsourced as well. And again, different projects take different approaches regarding this. So in Kaleidoscope, for instance, the data concerned questions, and these were collected by specialists, okay, motivated to do this. That's one option. In the case of Food EQA, the questions, let's say, or the textual data was derived from categories provided by the humans. Okay, so the textual descriptions or the questions in this case are automatically generated through templates. And this, of course, affects the uses and the results that you can get with data like this. So it's easy to collect data that is very fine-grained. Okay, so from simple procedures to collect classes and things associated with the images, you can form different types of questions automatically through the usage of templates. But the language used in these questions is not going to be as rich, for instance, as what you would get from real natural questions. Finally, in terms of the taxonomy that I presented originally, there's also this issue of binding, let's say, or compatibility between the modalities. Okay, so this photo and descriptions associated with this photo, from this person that probably some of you don't remember already. But the main idea was that different types of descriptions can focus on different aspects and can communicate information that is, let's say, compatible between modalities or that complements and having the different modalities information that is complementary. Okay. So from a picture like this or associated with a picture like this, you can, for instance, think of a description such as this one. Okay. A woman in a gray suit is giving a speech. Okay. So this is a very direct translation of the image contents, right? So sure, you see a woman wearing a suit. There are some clues there, like microphones that tell you that she is giving a speech. You can have descriptions like these that are short and very short, like this one. Nowadays, I would say that the tendency in most data sets is to have descriptions like these that are very dense, that cover all the different things that are present on this image. I mean, you could talk about the background, you could talk about the necklace that she was wearing, the color of the shirt, and whatnot. Okay, but the main idea is that there's a very direct relationship between the information present in the two modalities. And when you have something like this is very useful for learning particular types of models and specific things. Okay? Models that attempt to represent modalities in a compatible way. But on the other hand, if you attempt to collect data through different procedures from different sources, data that was originally created and made available for a different purpose, you may instead get a description like the one that you see here on the left. Okay? It applies to the same image. Okay? It is actually a caption that was provided with the same image, but that has very few relationships to the actual contents of the image. Okay? It provides complementary information. Okay? In this case, this caption was made in support of, well, an image that illustrates a given news article, right? And it focuses on different things about the event in which the image was collected. Okay? This can be quite useful as well. Okay? Actually, I would argue that most of the concerns nowadays and most of the more challenging things that you can do in the area actually involve translations like these, okay, that extend the original meanings of and the original information present in one modality. But it presents challenges, for instance, to learn, right? So if your data collection process gives you descriptions like this, it's going to be very hard to learn from something like this, a model that is able to translate between modalities. Okay. So different data collection processes also vary in terms of this binding, let's say. And in terms of the data that you have and the original purpose for which it was built, you're going to be having different things as well. One thing that is nowadays very common is to have systems that attempt to rewrite captions as they were originally collected from the web. Okay, so this is a current trend. So for building these huge data sets that support the training of large vision and language models, people start from data crawled from the web, like, I don't know, alt text in web pages associated with images. But then, because of problems associated with these, okay, in some cases, this alt text is a caption taken from a news article such as this one. In some cases, it's a very short description. So people use different strategies in order to rewrite these captions that were originally collected into something richer, into something a bit more useful that can support the training of vision and language model. So I have here also some examples or other examples of data sets beyond these let's say, use cases that illustrated the taxonomies. So these are more commonly used, let's say. These are the standard data sets that people use in the area. Okay? On the one hand, one very well-known example is Microsoft Common Objects in Context, or COCO. Right? So it's a very, very well-known data set, extensively used in the area. It features images paired to annotations that are textual descriptions, so small captions for the contents of the images. These were collected from people that were hired to do this. The dataset is very rich. It contains other types of annotations as well. So beyond captions, it also has object segmentation masks, bounding boxes for objects. Actually, different instances of objects are segmented. Okay, so it's extensively used in different computer vision tasks. In vision and language, it is used also to evaluate and to build image captioning models or cross-model retrieval systems, right? It's high quality, but even being high quality, notice, for instance, in this example that if you look closely, you're going to see some sheep annotated there, but there are some more sheep here in the back that are not annotated as well. Right? So I don't know, maybe people got bored, maybe something happened, right? So quality, even in these highly curated sources, in these data sets, you're going to be seeing issues. You're going to be encountering quality problems. So this is curated, extensively used, for instance, in image captioning. This is in the other extreme, crawled extensively from the web. Okay, so conceptual captions used to be a very important data set. Nowadays there are others, but it was extensively used for pre-training vision and language models. It had noisy captions, but it had a lot of images of different types collected from the web paired to descriptions. Okay, so a lot of filtering took place. So people crawl this data, and then they filtered the descriptions. They normalized the descriptions. The actual normalization procedure was not known. And one trick that the authors used in order to be able to distribute the data is that they gave you the textual descriptions plus URLs from where you could collect the images. But what happened is that, well, the web changes, and these URLs that existed at the time, several of them don't exist anymore. So if you attempt to use this data nowadays, you're going to be able to use a part of it. The other part probably is gone. Yet another well-known example, in this case, a data set focused on question answering. So in this case, it's images paired with questions and answers for these questions. Other more different tasks. So VQA can actually refer to a very large variety of problems. If you think about it, almost all different problems, you can frame them as asking a question about the image. So there are many different VQA datasets focused on different types of questions. So VQA V2 is a very general example. This other example here, visual common sense reasoning. In this case, this focuses on questions that target assessing common sense as present in situations featured in images. Okay, so this is a multiple choice question answering dataset in which you have a question that tackles some common sense thing. You're supposed to pick the right answer, and there's the dataset also featured annotations for, let's say, explanations behind the answers. Yet another example, let's see if I can play this. So sign language, okay? So this is actually a very interesting and relevant topic. I would say that the technology nowadays is mature enough to support lots of applications, for instance, in assistive technologies, okay, helping people with disabilities through vision and language models. That's a very hot topic nowadays. I mean, if you're interested in this, talk to me and in the coffee break. I would love to work on this as well. In this case, it's an example of a data set featuring signers, okay, performing sign language paired to textual descriptions. And through this, you can do a lot of things. You can detect specific signs, or you can attempt to do translation from sign language into text. Okay, so different tasks can be tackled with this as well. And yet another example. So in this case, similar to Kaleidoscope. So exam questions from textbooks, for instance, paired to the correct answers. There's Vision Arena, yet another example. In this case, images of different types paired to instructions, let's say, paired to requests and the corresponding answer. Okay, so these were actually collected from conversations of people with systems, okay, that involved asking the system to solve a given task over a given visual content and then the reply. In some cases with multiple turns, in some cases with a single turn. So it's kind of like dialogue, but involving a visual context and with a system on the other hand. So there are many, many, many examples of data sets, some more recent and classic, other more modern. I mean, we could go on here forever. Okay. So important takeaways. If you are collecting data from the web, one idea is that this collection should, as much as possible, be ethical, conform with existing licensing schemes. Okay, So there's, for instance, a lot of data that is available on the web, that is available through licenses that are very permissive, such as Creative Commons. Okay, so the more recent estimate is very, let's say, broad and not very precise, but they say tens of billions of items are available. Keep in mind that even though licensing exists and these contents are available and legally, let's say, you can use them, there are still issues in terms of, let's say, what was in people's minds when they originally released these data sets with these licenses. Okay? Keep in mind that in many cases, people were not expecting their Creative Commons licensed data to later on be used by or for training AI models. Okay? And with large-scale data collected from the web, you get the distribution of data as it exists on the world on large scale. And so if you don't curate, if you're not an opera set designer using the stereotypes, okay, you're going to be amplifying perhaps even the biases and the problems that exist with real world data. Okay, this is a famous example. So there's this model named CLIP. Okay, so if you attempt to assess the similarity between a given image and the textual description, okay, CLIP, which was trained with massive amounts of data collected from the web, in many cases gives some weird answers, okay, and it assigns a higher probability to a description that would be, well, let's say, unlikely to be given a high probability by a human as well. Okay, all because of existing trends and biases and professions that are more reflected on the web, that are, well, more prevalent on the real world, and because the web is a reflection of that, also reflected in that way on the web. Okay, so scale by itself is not a means to solve all the problems. So yeah, so I'm getting a bit late, so I'm going to go over these projects very quickly because I've talked about them already, and then move on to the second part. So sure, as the previous slide motivated, there's huge interest in collecting data that is truly representative of different views of the world, different cultures, different languages. Okay, so here before I talked about different projects that tackled specifically this issue. Still, it is true nowadays that most visual language research is English-centric, is centered on the Western world and the Western view of the world. Okay, so the images feature concepts that are common in Europe, in the US. Other cultures are not as reflected. Most of the images come from existing data sets that were collected under distribution like this. And this implies that vision and language models also have a very narrow, simplified view of the world. Okay, so motivating data collection efforts that attempt to tackle this. So I talked about this before, so I'm just going to be skimming through this in the interest of time. So food EQA was an example. Okay, in this case, tackling a very, very specific subdomain. Okay, Chinese cuisine. So it's a data set that was manually curated. Okay, so the examples came from humans that provided these images. It's very fine-grained. Okay, and attempts to subject systems to evaluation and to a task that is very, very specific. So the data set itself, well, it approaches or addresses 3 different tasks. Okay, so question answering in which you have multiple images involved, question answering in which you have multiple choices from a given image, and question answering in which there's just text. Okay, so the question is text. The dataset features these different tasks. The dataset was provided by humans. Okay, so it was curated. It involved, or the data collection involved, selecting different types of Chinese cuisine, selecting properties from a very detailed taxonomy, then collecting images and classes associated with these different types of cuisine and this taxonomy. Through templates, automatically then build questions that involve these aspects. And sure, different cuisine types were involved. The taxonomy was very fine-grained. I think I showed this before as well. So the image collection involves people confirming that the images that they were providing was not previously submitted to the internet. And later on, the questions, itself, some of them were written by humans as well, and they involved, let's say, being able to cover one type of cuisine, one or more aspects involved in the taxonomy. The questions focused, or the answers to the questions focused on these different aspects of the taxonomy. Overall, what could be concluded? So from tests with this data set, performance still lags behind humans, even though performance with closed models is approaching that. Native Chinese speakers perform the task better, okay? And accuracy was sensitive to different aspects, okay? So the type of model that was used to solve the task, it was sensitive also to whether or not the task was posed in native Chinese or in English, and also was sensitive to the type of prompt that was involved, okay? So you see here some boxes, right? So you see a box plot. The variation in the different boxes concerns trying the question with different prompts, okay, for soliciting an answer to the system. I think I showed this. The different types of image sources mattered as well. And depending on the types of, let's say, items from the taxonomy that were featured on the question, performance also varied, okay? So questions that focus, for instance, on how the food is plated or the region that concerns this ingredient and the food, these were much harder than questions focusing on other domains. So in terms of another example, Kaleidoscope, I presented it here as well, was collected through a very different procedure, right? So the focus here was questions from exams in different disciplines and different languages, coming from people speaking different languages and representing different cultures. So yeah, data was collected from volunteers that were later on, if further involved, asked to be collaborators in the final study as well. And the data collection tried to cover a large variety of languages, okay? So given constraints in terms of time, only 18 languages ended up being covered, but it's still quite good. Different topics were covered in the questions as well, and most of the questions were multimodal in the sense that they involved some sort of image of a particular type together with the question. The visual information could be of a very different type, so it could be diagrams or natural photos or maps, and you're going to see that depending on type, performance varied a lot as well. So in terms of results, what can be emphasized here? So closed models actually perform this task reasonably well, okay? Much better than open weight models. You can also see that performance varies depending on the subject matter of the questions, okay? So it's apparently easier to answer questions about humanities and social sciences than it is to answer questions about engineering topics, for instance, okay? Maybe this somehow reflects the frequency of data on the web as well. And different types of images can be more challenging to analyze by these models as well. Okay? So performance, for instance, on diagrams is much worse than performance on tables or photos. Good news is that the size of the models influences performance a lot as well. So as models scale, you also see an increase in accuracy. Okay, so scaling is one possible way of developing better systems that can tackle these data sets with higher accuracy. Okay, so I think with this, we finished this part about data sets. I would suggest that we still try to talk a bit about data representation before the break, but I think this is also a good time for some questions. Okay, so, okay, there's one here.
So I have one question regarding pre-training. So you mentioned one data set that consists of picture caption. So does pre-training only consist of that kind of data, which would be surprising to me because I don't think we can make that at big scale? Or is it the classical pre-training where you complete the word and then after that you kind of pre-train again on those? How does that look like?
Okay. So pre-training can actually mean a lot of different things, okay? And what goes into pre-training can vary, okay? But I would say that in most of these models, so on the one hand, these models don't start from scratch, okay? And you typically start from a pre-existing language model that was pre-trained to complete text already. And you attempt to bridge a vision encoder. In many cases, that was already pre-trained as well with a different pre-text task. This can be, for instance, trying to complete image regions as well, or it can be trying to align images with text. But you start from components that are pre-trained, and then you attempt to learn, let's say, a connector, a bridge between these two different models. And you use lots of data. So these large data sets of images paired with captions, for instance, are used for pre-training this connector. Okay. And after you pre-train this connector just with images paired with captions, typically, even before you attempt to teach these models to follow instructions, okay, you often use other data sets that are a bit more like question answering. So they focus on already tasks, okay? These are instructions, but not as diverse as the types of instructions that in the end you want these models to follow. So typically there are different stages, right? So you initialize the components and then you pre-train a connector and then you further train the connector with different types of data. These models are trained with different steps.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Oh, there's one there.
Thank you. So since current models are quite capable, what about machine annotated data? What are the good use cases, bad use cases, the limits, so on, so on?
So yeah, a lot of these data that you use, even for pre-training these models, I would argue that is machine annotated as well nowadays. Okay, so for instance, I talked about these conceptual captions data set, right? So it's very large, it's mostly descriptions collected from the web, but these are significantly filtered, rewritten. Okay, nowadays it's common also to have language models that just saw language and use these to rewrite descriptions that you collect, for instance, from the web, so that you get richer captions that in terms of the language diversity are richer. And you use these data in scale to pre-train these models, okay? So automatically annotated data exists a lot and is used very extensively in training vision and language models. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so you said that the visual models sometimes could generate the stereotypical description of people or image. So do you think these bias mainly come from the data or the model architecture or the way we evaluate those models?
I think it mostly, my point was that it comes from the data, right? So and there's nothing we can do about data that exists on the web, right? So you need to be proactive in terms of correcting these biases, okay? Just by using scale and collecting more data is not enough. So this different distribution is still going to be present there. And by intervening perhaps just on how models are made, it's going to be very difficult to correct this issue as well. So this is something that needs to be handled, in my opinion, through data, but through data creation, curation, by carefully selecting data in a way that balances the distribution that is more natural and that you don't like because it's not representative of the view that you want to have of the world. Any other question? Okay, so I think we can move on, even because we're getting a bit, well, delayed on time. So we talked about data, right? Following these, let's say, general architecture, okay, a next important thing would be the issue of data representation, okay? And in this case, mostly about how you represent vision data so that you can then bridge this with a language model, for instance, in order to create a visual language model. Now, there are different types of representations that we can consider, okay? Here I'm going to be arguing about a taxonomy that kind of splits these different possible strategies for creating representations into these three classes, okay? So on the one hand, you have perceptual representations, okay? So these focus on symbols, classes, language. They kind of abstract away from the real visual data and attempt instead to summarize the visual data through symbolic representations. Okay. On the other hand, you have pre-processed features. Okay. So these are representations that can, for instance, rely on pre-existing vision models. Okay. The idea is that you are going to be using, for instance, pre-existing models in order to detect relevant objects, relevant things, relevant stuff on the images. And then you're going to be creating representations that capture the visual part, let's say, of these interesting objects. Okay. So these have some advantages. They can be pre-computed, for instance. You can reuse existing things in order to compute these representations. They can be made smaller because they are focused on these interesting objects, but they are also more challenging to adapt. And finally, you have representations that are much closer to the raw inputs. Okay, I would say that nowadays this is a more common approach. So in more detail, what do you have in terms of these different types of representations? So perceptual representations. I would say that the key idea here is to abstract away from the actual raw data, from the visual components, from perception, and instead what you use to create these representations are human given or even automatically given, but you instead use symbolic concepts or linguistic concepts in order to create these representations. Okay, so this can be made automatically. You can use models, for instance, that classify the types of objects that exist in images, and you then represent an image by the set of objects that this detector sees. Or you can instead use humans. Okay, so you ask humans to detect the types of things, the types of emotions, the types of concepts, the types of things that are invoked by a given visual stimulus, and you represent the image using these concepts. Okay? So this connects to, for instance, studies in psychology that attempt to focus on cognition and perception, in which experiments are designed like this. So people are exposed to stimuli. This can be visual or they can be words. Okay, and then people are asked to describe what norms are invoked by these stimuli. And you collect these, okay? So in this example here, these words, moose, or an image of a moose, okay? To some people, this invokes being large, having legs, having fur, and so forth. And you can describe this concept, moose, by all these different properties that you can, for instance, try to categorize according to the type of information that is involved when trying to assign these concepts or these properties to the concept that, or to the word in this case that you are describing. Okay, so perceptual representations can be very powerful. Okay, so they can actually give you very, very rich features. Conceptually, this is simple, right? So you can use a human annotator, or you can use models in order to extract these things from the images that you're trying to represent. But there are also limitations, right? So there are limitations, for instance, in terms of scale. Scale, I mean, you can use automatic procedures to collect these representations, but scale in this case is more connected to how the richness of your representations can actually scale. Okay, and there are also issues in terms of ambiguity, right? So it's much harder to summarize what you're seeing by a given set of properties in a way that is truly unique. Okay. This also has interesting connections to, well, to, for instance, discussions that we had here in the summer school about how much you can actually learn from language alone versus from other modalities, or to this thought experiment by John Searle, in which he basically argued that meaning and strong AI, okay, is not really measurable by looking at results alone. Okay, so the thought experiment is something like this. So it involves having a person, okay, that is trying to communicate with someone else in Chinese, or the person speaks Chinese, the other person speaks some other language. And so in the middle, there's this room in which there's an operator that receives Chinese messages. This operator doesn't know any Chinese, but he has a manual that tells you how to translate the messages that he receives into symbols in the other language. Okay? So this person doesn't know any Chinese, it doesn't understand nothing of what he's receiving, but because he uses this procedure, this manual, he's able to do the translation. To the outside, you see this system, and to an outside observer, it seems that the system or the person inside knows Chinese, but in fact, it does not. Right? So this thought experiment connects to this idea of how much can you really say about understanding, let's say, just by observations like this. Okay? And how much can you actually learn by manipulating symbols alone versus having embodiment. Okay? Another interesting thing that comes to mind about this interesting, well, way of approaching representations connects to work that me and Desmond collaborated in. Okay, so we had a student, for instance, that in the past attempted to do image captioning by not using images at all. Okay, just using an existing model that was able to retrieve from a given database of texts what sentences are more similar to the image. And so the idea is that you can represent the image by a set of similar sentences, and through these sentences, can you summarize them? Can you generate a new description without seeing the image, just by seeing the sentences? And apparently you can do this, and you can do this quite well. Okay? So one way of approaching these problems, okay, it's particularly nowadays in which you have large language models that are very competent in doing things that resemble reasoning and planning, is to translate your multimodal inputs, your images, into concepts, into symbols, into linguistic representations, have a language model manipulate these in order to solve tasks. Okay? That's one possible approach to create these representations. Another possible approach involves something that is a bit more closer to using the actual image contents. And in the beginnings, when neural networks and computer vision attempted to use these techniques and people attempted to bridge computer vision representations with language models, what was used was pooled representations, for instance, from convolutional neural networks. Okay? The idea is that you use the convolutional neural network to represent an image. You train this neural network in a task such as image classification, and then you got intermediate representations from this network and use these to represent the image contents and bridge these with the language model, for instance. Now, these pooled representations could be made in different ways, for different purposes. On the one hand, people talked about pooled features when these were made closer to the, let's say, to the end of the network, to the part of the network that did classification. These are, let's say, higher level summaries. The idea is to have a single vector, for instance, that represents the entire contents of the image. Okay. Or instead, you could have features that are more representative of the, let's say, spatial arrangement of things in the image. So instead of doing pooling like this, taking the last vector, what you can take is the representations from intermediate layers of a convolutional network, for instance, which are representations that still feature some sort of spatial arrangement. Okay, so these are different vectors, but in which each of the vectors kind of corresponds to a region of the image. And you can take these and leverage this association between representations and specific parts of the image in order to solve different types of tasks. Okay. Another idea still concerns using pre-existing vision models that can, for instance, detect objects of interest in images in order to create pre-processed representations of images. So what's the idea here? So you can take a model focusing on doing object detection on images. So YOLO would be one example, faster RCNN would be another. And then what these models do is that they internally feature some components that kind of like propose which are the regions in the image that are more salient, that are more likely to contain objects that are interesting and relevant to describing the contents of the image. And so what you do is that you focus on these proposals, on these regions that are selected, and then you collect the representations from a given neural network for these specific regions. You can pre-compute this, store this, and then use these representations on your vision language model. Okay? This was another strategy that was very common. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of something like this? Okay, so this was, it has a long established practice. Okay, so this is used for a long time. It was used since the beginning. It's also good that it's offline. So because it's offline, it can be, so creating these representations for the image contents can be made once and then reused multiple times in a way that is relatively cheap. Okay. The downside is that, well, if you pre-compute these, if you then need to process very large data sets, that you need to store these representations. So you need to think of some specialized mechanism for storing these. It's much harder to process new inputs, right? So doing things like image augmentations, for instance, in which you slightly adapt or transform the image in order to consider a slightly different input. It's much harder to apply strategies like these when you are pre-computing the representations. Okay. And up until recently, doing things like these required specialized knowledge in the sense that you were supposed to know how to use these region detection models. You needed to use specialized software frameworks to run these models. This was separate from whatever you wanted to do next in terms of bridging language and vision. So in terms of engineering systems that work like this, it was and still is a bit more, let's say, difficult. I would say nowadays the more common approach is instead to process things closer to the raw inputs, okay? And the model of choice, again, nowadays to represent images are transformers, okay? Basically, as you just saw here in previous classes, okay? So for processing and generating image representations, people nowadays use vision transformers, okay, which are not that different from standard transformers. There are some ideas that try to specialize this a bit, so I'm not going to talk about this, but there's this variation called the Swin transformer that essentially combines ideas from convolutional networks and transformers. So it's a transformer in which attention is made just over regions of images, and different layers kind of like consider different arrangements of the regions. So you don't pay the full cost of doing self-attention over a very large set of image regions, right? It's more compact and brings in this idea of convolutional neural networks of locality in processing visual information. So it's a specialized model for vision, but it's not that different from a standard transformer. And for different types of multimodal inputs, the same idea also applies, right? So for audio, for instance, when you're trying to classify environmental audio, for instance, it's very common to also see audio as a sort of image, okay? So a spectrogram, which is essentially a representation of the audio signal in which you divide or you represent audio as energy associated with different bins or that decode or encode different frequencies, and you process these images, okay, kind of like with the standard vision transformer. So for processing multimodal inputs, this is nowadays the standard method. The good news is that you already know this, okay? So this is very, very similar to what you saw here in previous lectures, okay? In some cases, these transformers, they all different transformer architectures nowadays have some slight variations, some slight adaptations over the original thing, okay? So in vision transformers, for instance, it's very common to have these layer normalization layers before the transformations instead of after, okay? But it's a minor thing. And just a minor detail here. So when you see vision transformers and you attempt to, I don't know, download models like these and use them in your projects, you're going to see a nomenclature like this that seems kind of cryptic, but it's actually relatively easy to decode, okay? So you see names like these. There's a part of this name that encodes the, let's say, the type of model, so a regular VIT or a Swin transformer. In some cases, the name decodes, let's say, the training objective as well. You see a letter that usually denotes the size of the model, the number of layers, the number of attention heads. Okay, so typically these vary from tiny models, small, base, huge, things like this. And you see some numbers that encode the number of pixels that is represented through each patch. So each token, let's say, in this transformer sequence, how many pixels are involved. Okay, so 14 by 14 pixels or 32 by 32 pixels, okay? The smaller this number, the more patches you need to represent your images. And then there's another number that encodes the original input resolution of the images that are considered. Okay? So these two numbers interact, the patch size and the input resolution, and through these you give an estimate of the number of tokens that are involved in processing images with the transformer. Okay, and notice that this can become quickly very large. Okay, so and again, self-attention is quadratic on sequence length. Okay, so it's hard to process high-resolution images with models like this. It's hard to process many different images with models like this. So yeah, in terms of how you use these models to extract features, you can either, as happened in CNNs, you can either pool features and have a single summary that represents an entire image, or you can instead use embeddings that correspond to different patches, different subregions of this image. And on the recent literature, and this is going to be covered a bit more in detail in the second part, you also have that there are concerns about how you can extend these models to process very high resolution images, or how you can extend these models to process many images, so sequences, videos, for instance. As I said, okay, computationally, this is very challenging. So in the recent literature, you're going to encounter many different ideas in terms of how you can simplify, reduce the size of the sequences that you need to process, or limit attention operations. Okay. So I'm not going to go into very much detail about this, but you can, for instance, consider strategies in which you, instead of processing a very high resolution image in its entirety, you kind of split it into different patches. You use self-attention just in different regions of the image, okay, and represent each image region independently, and then you fuse these sequences later on, avoiding the cost of having to do self-attention for very large images. Other ideas instead represent images normally, but then look at the different tokens that encode different patches and attempt to reduce these sequences. Okay, for instance, through similarity between the tokens and trying to merge in a single token all of those that are very similar. Okay, so in the recent literature, you see many examples of techniques that allow you to extend this idea of using self-attention to represent images and to bridge images with language models in a way that is efficient, in a way that avoids having to process very long sequences. So I have here some, more detailed illustrations about how you can do this, but I guess my summary more or less covered this as well. And yeah, so we're way over time. I think we can stop here. And I'll be outside in the coffee break, okay, taking questions. I can take a couple of questions here as well. And yeah, for now, this is it. We'll continue with how you can bridge this modeling part with language models and how you create these vision language models, taking these representations and bridging them with language models, okay?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, some of you can hear me, others cannot. Okay. My name is Desmond Elliott. I would like to start by thanking Bruno for delivering the first part of the lecture today. I think he did a wonderful job. I was a bit overwhelmed to see how well he presented this. In the remainder of today's lecture, we're going to cover methods for multimodal modeling, research on trying to understand how multimodal vision and language models work, and then a short piece at the end where I'll talk about some future directions that will hopefully inspire you if you're also interested in working in this area. I believe that I am required to finish at 12:30 sharp. Maybe not. I will do my best to finish as sharply as possible so we can all get out for lunch and enjoy the sunshine on this Saturday morning. The main approaches for multimodal vision and language modeling can be generally classified into three areas. those based on the cross-encoding of vision and language data, those based on a language model cross-attending into visual representations, and more recently, using visual inputs as prefixes to a pre-trained language model. The cross-encoding approach emerged in 2019, shortly after the proposal of the BERT language model, which I think you covered earlier in this course. This is a form of model-based fusion where the backbone consists of two components. There's a pre-trained language encoder, which is going to process the textual data. And then there's a pre-trained visual encoder, which will process the image inputs. And at the time, there were a variety of different architectures, which mostly boiled down to being whether the model processed the data as a single stream of inputs. In this case, the vision data and the language data were concatenated into a single input sequence. And then the transformer blocks had their multi-head self-attention operate over all of the inputs simultaneously. An alternative paradigm that existed at this time was dual stream models, where there was an interleaving of intramodal and intermodal attention, where the intramodal was only performing cross attention within either the vision or the language data. And in this case, you could see it as these steps enriching the vision or the language representations. And then the intermodal steps were transferring features from one modality into another. And some representative models of this period of time would be something like Vilbert, which was a dual stream model where the parameters were initialized from BERT and the visual features were extracted using between 10 to 36 regions from a pre-trained image model called Faster RCNN. This is directly related to what Bruno spoke about before the break about using object proposals as the inputs to vision and language models. These regions were provided by this type of object proposal network. And this Vilbert model was pre-trained on a dataset called conceptual captions, which was 3 million images paired with sentences on a combination of pre-training tasks related to masked language modeling, masked region classification, and image text matching, where you try to force the model to say whether or not this was an aligned pair of image text inputs. The Vilt model, I think, really started a trend towards working directly with the raw image data, as Bruno mentioned at the end of the second part of the lecture this morning. Vilt is not a dual stream model, it's a single stream model. It's initialized from the BERT language model, and it uses visual features that are extracted directly from image patches using a transformer base model. So here, that's the VIT-B, and the patches were 32 by 32 pixels. So it's quite a coarse-grained representation of the input image data. In this case, the Vilt model was pre-trained on more data than something like Vilt, so it not only had conceptual captions, it also included visual genome for highly specialized fine-grained descriptions of image regions, the Microsoft COCO dataset, which Bruno also described earlier this morning, and the SBU captions dataset, which is 1 million images paired with sentences extracted from Flickr. And once again, it was trained on a reasonably similar set of pre-training tasks as we saw for the Vilbert model on the previous slide. In 2022, the Flava model went back to this idea of using a dual stream architecture where each individual modality, in this case, the image modality or the text modality, had its own localized encoder. So this would be a masked language model for text or a vision transformer for the image data. And each of these had their own modality-specific pre-training tasks. So for example, the vision encoder was used to do ImageNet classification, or the language model was used to solve some common NLP tasks. But then the combination, the fusion of these two modalities was in a randomly initialized transformer on the top, which was then used to solve multimodal vision and language tasks like vision and question answering or image sentence matching, like Bruno described earlier in the lecture. And this was pre-trained on a much larger data set than what we had seen before at the time. This was 70 million publicly available examples. And this model performed at the state of the art at the time. Sadly, the state of the art has now moved on from these dual encoding type approaches, and they are no longer in fashion. But I think there's still some interesting historical information that we can get from reading about these approaches. If we move on towards the dual encoding methods, Bruno has already described this on several previous occasions. This is a much more sample efficient alternative to cross encoding, mostly because the dual encoding architecture has different backbone models that produce commonly a single vector that represents the output of the input data. And then this single vector can be used for downstream tasks, or you could step one layer back and have patchwise output representations. The most commonly known dual encoding model is the CLIP method. So CLIP is based on transformer architecture for language and either a transformer or a ResNet architecture for the image data. And it's trained to maximize the similarity of embeddings of paired image text examples while minimizing the similarity of unpaired data points. And this uses a large data set of a somewhat unclear provenance. If you read the footnotes in the original paper that presents this, you will find it difficult to imagine how you would recreate this data. But there is the Open Clip initiative, which has done an excellent job of creating a series of models and data sets that approximate what was used by OpenAI to train these models. There's also more recent developments with a model called MetaClip, which scales up both the model size and the data to be more modern in terms of their scope. And so there is still a lot of benefit that can be gained from using these types of pre-trained vector representations. The cross-attention method that I described earlier was popularized through a model called Flamingo. I think this was published by Google DeepMind. And so the way the Flamingo model worked was that it was trained where you took a large language model and you injected randomly initialized cross-attention layers into the language model backbone. And these randomly initialized layers were then trained to attend into the visual representations of interleaved image text data points. Everything else in the language model was kept frozen. And so in this case, you are now taking all of the knowledge or abilities that have been learned from language only pre-training and adapting this to being able to process vision and language multimodal, and in this case, sequential data. At the same time, an idea emerged for what is now known as visual prefix learning. And in this case, in visual prefix learning, you will have a pre-trained language model where the parameters can be completely frozen. And you want to force the visual representations that come out of either a ResNet encoder or perhaps a vision transformer to align with the visual representation space of to align with the representation space of the LLM embeddings. And so this type of approach can be trained using a standard cross-entropy objective of completing the next set of tokens that would describe an image, and then backpropagation only updates a learned projection layer or a connector, and in some cases also the vision encoder itself directly. This basic idea defines the state of the art in how vision language models are being pre-trained or fine-tuned in 2026. So the basic strategy for how you would train one of these models is that you would start with having two pre-trained models, a vision encoder and a language model. And then you would define a connection layer between those two models. And I'll discuss some different possibilities that have been proposed for what this connection layer should be. And then you also want to find either a large or extremely large amount of data that you can use to train this connection layer. You may also update the parameters in the language model itself, and you may also update the parameters in the vision model. And one thing that we're seeing increasingly in the literature is that this is not only a monolingual endeavor, there are multilingual data that's being used to perform this continued pre-training of these two frozen pre-trained model components. If we look at some of the earlier literature in this area, for example, the first generation of these visual prefix models like Lava or QuenVL or PalyGemma or the MM1 model from Apple, one thing that we can see is that there was really no consensus about how to design these model components, how to reuse existing pre-trained models. In the case of all of these, the size of the vision encoders are completely unrelated to each other. The language models vary from 1.3 billion parameters up to 13 billion. Some of these are pre-trained. For example, the Quen language model or the Gemma 2B, some of them are trained from scratch. For example, the 1.3 billion parameter model used in the MM1 model from Apple. Now I think that there's a bit more agreement on trying to specialize these models around parameter sizes like 1 billion or 4 billion or 8 billion. And a lot of this is also based on trying to target particular types of GPU sizes that we could expect people to have access to. So those are the pre-trained model specific components. What about this connector? Earlier work in this area did a lot of excellent, careful scientific study of how to design this. So the PalyGemma model had this idea of mapping the image output embeddings, in this case from the vision transformer, into the language model space just using a simple linear map. They tried many different possible combinations of how to connect these modalities together. Multi-layer perceptrons, for example, different convolution blocks. QuenVL actually had this kind of adapter method that was very similar to an idea from Maple, from EACL 2024, where they tried to have a learned compression of the visual input data, given a fixed number of learnable queries. The Apple MM1 model had a complicated convolutional abstractor that tried to use ResNet blocks to resample the visual data. The main message that seems to have been learned through all of this early experimentation is that this simple linear layer introduced and widely experimented in PalyGemma is really effective and super sample efficient. And if you're going to continue pre-training on 1 billion data points to create a vision language model, that's something that's very important. In terms of the earlier pre-training data sets, something like the Lava model, which was, I think, really the first publicly available visual prefix model that we could use, it was trained on 600,000 image caption examples that were filtered from the conceptual captions dataset. If we look at something like the QuenVL model, this was trained on a combination of English and Chinese data at the 1.4 billion sample scale. Apple's MM1 dataset model was trained on 2 billion examples that combined image and text data together. The PalyGemma model was trained on 1 billion examples that combined multilingual image captions, VQA, and various in the wild datasets. And these larger models were coming out of more like frontier labs where they were pre-training this on enormous amounts of in-house data that we don't have access to. So PalyGemma was trained on the Webley dataset of more than 1 billion examples. MM1 was also trained on more than 1 billion examples of in-house data. There are some really good initiatives now on trying to give researchers like us access to high quality, large scale data sets. So Bruno mentioned this at the first part of the talk. The Lion data set is one such example of billions of examples. And through rewriting the data in Lion, you can also squeeze out a huge amount of additional performance compared to the original captions. So what were some of the original training strategies here? This was typically performed using multi-stage fine-tuning, using different types of data and different image resolutions at different stages of the continued training of these pre-trained models. This is a very instructive example taken from the original Quen VL paper, where in the first stage of pre-training, the model has just general image text pairs. The images are presented in a low resolution. The language model is frozen. The vision transformer can be updated, and so can the connector layer between the vision model and the language model. And then this is trained using cross entropy, where the gradients are back propagated all the way down the language model to learn the connector representations and also to adapt the vision transformer to the domain of the image text distribution that you have for continued pre-training. After this is complete, they then unfreeze the language model. And then instead of just training the model on next token prediction for image caption pairs, they now have more specialized multitask adaptation data. For example, answering questions about image or referring expression realization, or maybe even pointing to objects and images. And in this case, you still want to continue training the vision transformer and the connector, but you also want to start training the language model so that it learns about these new tasks that you want the model to solve. In this case, they also start to increase the resolution of the input image data. It has been shown many occasions that higher resolution images are useful for a variety of tasks, but they're not always useful for more kind of high level tasks like describing images. But if you want to count the number of sheep in an image, like Bruno mentioned earlier, having a higher resolution input can make a big difference in how your model will perform there. And then in this case, the very final stage of this multi-stage pre-training or post-training was taking the absolute highest quality data that the researchers from the QN team could find to freeze the vision transformer and then just continue training the connector layer between the two model components and continue training the language model. And this would be things like actual chat interaction data between humans and machines or humans and other humans, where you're really trying to make the model more conversational because you want to believe that it has learned most of the required skills and properties from the previous two stages of training. So if you had a lot of compute, this is what you would do. The majority of us don't have access to the amount of compute that would be available at QN or at Google DeepMind. And one of the things that has been a trend in recent years is focusing on how can we train small vision and language models. I think this is of great interest to people like yourselves because this is something that you could do by yourselves in your own university contexts or maybe even within your own laptops if you have one of these Apple M5 processors or something similar to this. So Hugging Face released a family of models called Small VLM, where they specifically tried to create models at the 256 million parameter size, going all the way up to 2 billion parameters. And they used publicly available data for the pre-training that they did of these models, and they wrote, I think, a really excellent technical report describing the design decisions that they made along the way and the major findings that they had from their experiments. So one of the interesting observations they had was about the interaction between the number of parameters in different parts of the model and how this affects final model performance. So in this case, we're showing on the left-hand side, the encoder parameters are in the vision encoder. So how big is your vision transformer? And as you can see here, increasing the size of the vision transformer can give a really huge boost in performance, as long as it's actually paired with a large enough language model that can take the representations from the vision transformer and do something useful with it. And that's shown here on the x-axis, where the total parameters is now the combination of the vision transformer and the language model backbone. On the right-hand side, they also did a lot of experiments with increasing context length within the language model. So is there always a benefit to increasing the number of textual tokens the model can either encode or produce as outputs? And you can see here that increasing context length from 2,000 tokens to 8,000 tokens gives a really huge boost in performance. But this also comes at the cost of having a much larger pre-training budget in terms of the amount of GPU resources and time you would need. They also find that learned position embeddings are super important for trying to integrate the vision data into the language model, and exactly how you define how you're going to explain where the vision tokens are also has a massive impact on how the vision language model performs at the end. They also have some experiments on what happens if you try to continue training using chain of thought data. And in this case, they used the Smalltalk dataset, which was also an output of the Hugging Face organization. And they found that chain of thought data, in this case, typically actually hurt the performance of the model. And so I think that as a scientific object, the small VLM models and the technical reports with them are a great source of learning if you want to know more about how these types of vision language models can be trained. Another family of models do you want to have a question?
Yeah, sorry. My question is, why do you think that is? Why did it hurt the models, the chain of thought training?
I think in this case, it's because a lot of this chain of thought data was not visually grounded. They were trying to keep the ability of the model to perform these chain of thought reasoning chains, but they weren't strictly related to video data. And so what we actually see with the Vision Arena dataset, which is what Bruno discussed earlier this morning, that data is extremely useful for pre-training vision language models, because those are natural conversations of people interacting with VLMs. That's great data. Trying to repurpose existing textual data, not so great.
Got it. Thank you.
Another family of models I would like to talk about are the Malmo models. These are models created by the Allen Institute for AI. And I think these are really also great scientific artifacts. So these are open weights models with open data, and the researchers and the technical reports are very transparent about what they use for training the model and what drives performance in these models. Almost all possible ablations that you could perform on which combination of different model components matters, it's all there in these articles. And the design of these models brings together many of the different topics that have been discussed so far in this lecture. And if you look over here at the right-hand side, this is the design, an illustration of the design of the Malmo architecture. It basically looks like what we've been talking about. So you have your vision inputs, you split it into patches. The patches are encoded by a vision encoder. There's a learned connector that goes from the vision encoder outputs into the LLM. This is a visual prefix model. And then the input textual task is point to Mount Rainier. I don't know how to pronounce this word. If somebody's from Seattle, you can tell me later. It's a mountain outside of Seattle. And then the model is trained through its post-training to learn to be able to geolocate and point to specific things within the image. The datasets that drive the training of the OLMO model are called PIXMO, and the PIXMO datasets consist of like one really cool innovation, which was the researchers collected descriptions of images using voice data. So instead of asking people to write text into Mechanical Turk or some kind of crowdsourcing platform, they asked them to speak about the image that they saw. And they found through their experimentation that this was a great way to collect really detailed long-form descriptions about images compared to asking somebody to write the sentences using their keyboard. And they were able to collect, I think, a data set of 600,000 or 700,000 of these really long form spoken descriptions of the images, which they then transcribed into text and used this to pre-train the model. In addition to this, they also have a combination of different synthetic data sets that were model generated. Someone asked a question about this in the first part of the lecture. This is something that is happening now at quite a large scale. So things like taking an original image from the PIXMO dataset and running an object detector on it. This is a way you can get object labels. You can use that to continue training the model to do object recognition. Or, for example, taking the original dense captions and then using an LLM to split them out into region-based descriptions that you can then combine with the object detector outputs that you have. All of this is being driven by off-the-shelf models that are specialized to these tasks. And then they're creating these new data sets that you can use to continue training the models that then also give the models different types of abilities, or as they call this here, skills, in the PIXMO and MALMO art paper. So in terms of the data that was used to continue pre-training MALMO, it's a combination of PIXMO, which we just saw on the previous slide, and existing academic data sets specialized to tasks like VQA or chart understanding or maybe image captioning. And the paper has really clear documentation about the hardware that's required to do continued training of this or fine tuning, and also how much time is it going to take you. And I think this is really useful. So if you want to do this by yourself and you want to convince your colleagues or your supervisor to let you do this, you can say, I only need 850 hours on H100 GPUs. And that is quite a lot. I've no doubt about that, but at least it's a concrete number that you can point to, and you're being very clear about this. Obviously, you're probably not going to start at the 72 billion parameter scale with 8,000 GPU hours, but nevertheless, I think this is a really useful learning and education resource to recreate some of this by yourself in your own setup. And in terms of understanding what matters, the MALMO paper has really great ablation studies on what's driving performance. So as Bruno mentioned just before the break, this idea of having different image crops and recombining features from coarse and fine-grained views of the image gives huge performance boosts for the MALMO models across 11 different tasks. That's what the 11 average column means. Some tasks really do benefit from having finer grained information. And if you think about it, chart understanding or OCR out of documents is definitely going to benefit from this. Dropout in the large language model. I assume that you learned about dropout earlier this week before I arrived in Lisbon. Dropout is still really useful, even at the scale of billions of parameters within neural nets at this type of setup. The specialized fine-tuning data that they prepared in PIXMO is also extremely useful for boosting performance. So going from the academic-only dataset to including the PIXMO and the academic data gives you about 4 points boost in performance across the 11 tasks. And then they also have these very careful experiments on what happens when you remove different tasks from the continued training set. So if you know that you want to specialize one of these models towards a given direction, there's a lot of information here about how this fine-tuning dataset will help you reach that goal. And also, with regards to the pre-training, so this would just be the kind of general image text dataset, they compare the quality that can be gained from different types of pre-training data. So the shared GPT-4 is data that was created by a language model, the GPT-4 language model, and compared to just using the raw transcripts of the Pixmo voice data, it's much worse than having these much more carefully described descriptions of the image data. And then as you go down this column here, you can see that having the cleaned transcripts gives you a huge boost in performance compared to not cleaning the data. And then at the very bottom, this was something that Bruno mentioned in the first part of the talk. Instead of doing any of this human interaction, you could just ask a model like GPT-4 to describe the images for you and use that for pre-training. That's actually a viable purpose. Sorry, it's actually a viable approach if you have an enormous amount of money to give OpenAI in order to produce millions of image captions for you. Maybe that would be more expensive than human voice. I'm not sure. I would need to look at the appendix here. But I think that this is really great information that we can use as researchers to learn about what we would want to do in our own cases. And then when you take this to the case of Malmo 2, now the data mixture is huge compared to Malmo 1. And it also covers video tasks, not just still image processing tasks. When Malmo 2 was released in January 2026, its models were competitive against Intern VL 3.5 and Qwen 3 VL on video understanding tasks. But what we know is that teams like Intern VL and Qwen have been advancing really fast in the time in between. And so I believe now the Qwen 3.5 model is going to be outperforming this. But even at these 4 billion parameter scales, these models, I think they're very competitive. And they're fully documented. They're open weights, they're open data, and I think they're great educational resources for trying to understand how vision language models work. Obviously, I'm aware of the fact that models like GPT-5 or Claude Opus are amazingly good at performing these types of tasks, but I don't know anything about how they work. I can see that they work, but I don't know what kind of educational information I can discuss with you today if I talk about how well GPT 5.4 performs on this. So that's why I haven't really covered it in any detail in the lecture here. So in summary, in terms of the modeling techniques that we've seen in the literature, the earliest work focused on cross-encoding. This is now mostly not pursued because it's very expensive and it doesn't allow you really to use it as a generative model of text. The dual encoding approach, as popularized by CLIP, is still being used very often in many different types of vision and language tasks and applications. And what we're seeing now is that most models, if not all of the models that you are probably using if you're doing vision and language research, is based on this idea of visual prefix learning, where we can exploit the benefits of single modality pre-training that we get from image-only tasks or text-only tasks, and then adapt this into our multimodal space. Before I continue, I think I can stop and maybe take a couple of questions if anybody has something they would like clarification about.
So you mentioned that they had voice data. I mean that they had captions primarily in the form of voice data. So the question is, did they utilize this voice modality in any sort of way, or can it be utilized to enhance something? I mean, not just text.
I do not believe that they used the voice data directly. I think that it was transcribed, before being given as textual tokens as input to the model. But I think it would be an interesting application of seeing how you could use the original voice data as an interface to interacting with these models. I don't know if the voice data is actually publicly available. There might be some PII concerns about sharing that, but it's a great idea.
Thank you.
So hi, I would like to ask, how do you compare the fine tuning between the vision model and the language model? Because actually, as a user, when I generated picture using GPT, I found it's less effective by fine tuning a picture by using a prompting. Like for example, I usually find that if I have already asked the GPT to generate a picture, then I want to change some characteristics within the picture, but it will be very difficult to like I mean, the fine tuning is less effective compared with language model. And also, I'm wondering whether it is because like, according to your introduction, the vision models, they have very limited pre-training data compared to the language model. I'm guessing like whether it could be the reason or, thank you.
So my knowledge of the area that you're describing is maybe a couple of years old now. But at least a couple of years ago, what people were doing for image generation was to use diffusion models, where you might give the original image as an input or the generated image as an input. And then you would also have your textual prompt, which might be something like turn the background into a mountain scene. In that case, the diffusion model can either operate directly in pixel space or it can operate in the latent space of the diffusion transformer. And training this is much harder than training an autoregressive language model. And so I think that this is probably the main reason why it's difficult to have these types of image edit operations succeed. I know that QN maybe has an Omni model called QN 3.50, which should be able to do this, but I have not used it myself and I don't know how effective that is. But at least it should be publicly available with the weights, so you could experiment with it by yourself.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. I was wondering, you mentioned before using a vision language model to caption data sets used to train other vision language models like ChatGPT 4o. Do you not think this maybe places an upper bound on the capabilities of a model which learns from these kinds of data sets? Like it can only be as good as the model which generated the captions, in which case, why would you bother? Thank you.
I do agree with you. I think that's an astute point. And I think that there's even a study on the open clip data set of what happens if you improve the quality of the image to text generative model and then use it to train an image text matching model. I can find the reference for you and share it with you later, but they do show that what you suggest is absolutely the case.
Hello.
Hello.
Talking about the bias that Bruno talked earlier, and now with model-based descriptions. So if you have a model that already has a bias and it's describing a picture and you're kind of propagating the bias there, how do you fix it? Because I also didn't get how you can fix it before. And also, you also could have unseen data. I imagine you can do scaling with that, but bias still remains. So how do you fix it?
This is a question without a simple answer. So a couple of years ago, I was involved in a project where we tried to focus on addressing some of the issues in gender bias in image text understanding models. We chose gender bias because it was possible for us to enumerate the space of pronouns that could be used in gendered reference to individuals in the English language. In this case, we were able to manipulate our post-training data in order to randomly rewrite gender-specific sentences into gender-neutral sentences so that the models did not learn distributional biased associations. For example, I think the most common one discussed in the NLP literature is that men are doctors and women are nurses. In this case, if we take that type of data that describes images and we randomly replace these gendered pronouns like his and her or he and she, we can try to reduce the biases that the model learns in this specific type of bias. Dealing with the broader problem of bias in language models is something that we didn't tackle in that project. And I think it's much more complicated than trying to enumerate all of the possible words or phrases that would bring that to light. I'm not familiar with what the state-of-the-art literature is doing in this area, but I imagine that frontier labs that are making models available in exchange for a subscription that costs real money are seriously invested in trying to avoid these types of biased outputs and behaviors, but I don't know what they're doing. In the interest of time, I would like to continue because I have 70 slides and 34 minutes. So it's an impossible task. I may skip some of the slides along the way, but as Bruno showed at the start of the lecture, there was a QR code and you can download the slides already. So if I skip over something, you can just catch up as homework or something. Okay. I would prefer not to take this question because I don't have the time. I will talk to you after the lecture and we can continue that discussion. Okay, so now I want to present kind of an example study that I was involved in of trying to do vision and language modeling research. And in particular, we were interested in how could we squeeze out more performance from small vision and language models, which I think small models are super cool because you can run them on edge devices like mobile phones, or you can run them and train them on your laptops, which I think opens up a lot of possibilities. And so in this case, I was collaborating with one of my PhD students on this idea of test time scaling and test time compute, which I believe Zita spoke about 2 evenings ago in her lecture on reinforcement learning. So some of this stuff I won't really need to re-describe because Zita has already done a much better job at describing it than I did. So test time scaling has really emerged in the last couple of years as an approach to not invest all of our compute time in ever larger pre-training budgets, but instead to develop techniques that allow models to process input data for longer, trying to maybe find different types of solutions or to explore different options. And there's a lot of different things that you can try to scale when you're doing test time scaling or test time adaptation. And it could be the length of a single reasoning trajectory, or it could be that you increase the number of trajectories pursued by the model and then find a way of aggregating those different trajectories or backtracking from them when it seems like there's no possible way to continue. And so one of the motivations we had for this is that small VLMs are quite efficient, they're super accessible, but their performance is a bit lackluster. And this is an example here of the small VLM 2.2 model where if you ask it a pretty straightforward question like, is the pigeon standing in the image? The model says no, absolutely not. The pigeon is perched on top of the coin return machine, which is really not the type of behavior we'd like to see from this model. We want it to realize that standing and perching are interchangeable. And so what we tried to explore here was whether test time scaling was an approach to allow models to think differently or to think for longer. And this is model computation thinking, not human thinking, if we think back to the anthropomorphization discussion yesterday. And so the key problem here is that existing test time scaling methods are usually going to work on things like having external verifiers, which are expensive to run and require a large compute budget. Or you're going to generate many, like maybe 64 candidate responses and then aggregate them together to produce a final output. And instead of going for external verifiers along the way, what we did was to propose a framework that was quite compute efficient. So if we take an input image and a question like this, we do the simplest thing we could do, which was to augment the data. Now, augmentation is something that has proven extremely useful in computer vision and also in natural language processing. And so from this original input, we have a family of image transformations and text transformations that will rewrite or redraw or reorient the multimodal data. And then these n augmented inputs are given to a vision language model. And for this particular input example, we then get n different next token probabilities for how to continue this or how to produce an output response. And then we have an aggregation function that gives us an aggregated probability distribution from which we can sample the next token or the answer token, which is then appended to the shared context for all of the n different augmented inputs. And this goes back into the VLM, and then we continue this. So we have all of these different views of trying to solve the same problem. And we have this aggregation point right here, the aggregated probabilities step. And this is our test time augmentation framework. And this has no learnable parameters. If we want to have learnable parameters, we can take the next token that would be sampled from the aggregated distribution and use this as a pseudo label to do supervised fine tuning of the VLM. That's very expensive. It takes a huge amount of compute to do that, but it does bring extra improvements in performance, which I will discuss in a few minutes. I'm going to skip over this because it's super detailed. So here are some examples of the augmentations that we have. So this is the original input. This is the image and this is the text, who is the author of this book. We can see all the different image augmentations, and these are either things like image rotations or manipulations of the color space or the insertion of pepper noise into the input data. And the text transformations are weird. I'm going to discuss the different types of text transformations that we tried. The most effective text transformation was to randomly delete characters from the original question. I know that sounds crazy, but I will present some empirical evidence to support the claim. And then we also found that appending the original question was critical to actually scaling the performance as we gave the model more examples. So we experimented with this on 9 different tasks that are based on visual question answering, multiple choice questions, yes, no binary question answering, and image captioning. And we did all of our experiments using the small VLM 2.2 billion parameter model. And then when we add in the untrained test time augmentation, the performance across our tasks boosts out to this pink set. And then when we also combine this with test time adaptation, so the learned component, then it's the purple set of performance results here. And in the study, we have a lot of experiments. We look at how to augment the data, what is the optimal method for achieving this augmentation, and where and why should you do it. In terms of the language model itself, where do you aggregate features before you try to perform an output operation? Is there an optimal layer for aggregation, and how do you adapt this model? And then we also explored things like, how do you aggregate these next token probabilities? And is there an optimal method for achieving that? There's a lot to go through and the time is against us. So I'm going to try and go through the takeaways here. In terms of how to induce diversity in the vision language model outputs, one of the most obvious approaches here would just be to do temperature sampling. You would take the image data and the original question and you would manipulate the temperature to produce diverse outputs. This does not work nearly as well as input perturbations to the original image and text data. And one of the really nice things about the input perturbations is that we get these different views of the data and then we can do greedy decoding. So we don't need to have some of the variation that temperature sampling might give us, which at the 2.2 billion parameter scale is not necessarily going to be the best thing for the outputs of our model. In terms of the aggregation levels, there's a collection here of existing test time scaling methods based on self-consistency or self-synthesis. And all of those work at the answer level. So instead of doing the aggregation at each token, which is what we do in our approach, they will generate the whole output and then aggregate before in order to produce the output. Whereas we do token level averaging of the distributions produced for the next token, and this is slightly better than self-synthesizer, but much better than previous approaches like self-consistency or sample and rank. In terms of the aggregation methods, the simple averaging based on taking the distribution we have is super simple and effective. You can try things like majority voting or entropy weighted averaging. None of that really gives you an improvement over doing the simplest thing possible, which is useful because you want to be able to do test time scaling by maximizing the amount of time you're using the GPU rather than performing operations that are not related to producing next tokens. In terms of where you might want to aggregate the next token probabilities, what we typically find is that language-heavy tasks benefit from aggregation in later layers, but some vision tasks, for example, image captioning shown here in the COCO captions, this seems to be better to aggregate at early layers, and we do not have an explanation for why that is. But if you look at the rolling average on the bottom right corner, generally aggregating at deeper layers in the language model is almost always a good idea. You can also ask questions about how many augmentations should you do in order to take advantage of the on-device compute. So the dashed gray line is the average of all of the tasks, and it pretty much plateaus after 16 augmentations based on the augmentation techniques that we were exploring here. And it's not as if there's some kind of, well, obviously the GQA task greatly, no, the OCR VQA task greatly benefits, but most of them plateau out quite early along the way. And in terms of the computational overhead of doing this, because that's something you want to think about carefully when you're doing test time scaling, it depends on whether you have an approach that is based on a parallelized implementation or a sequential implementation. In the sequential implementation, you pay the cost of it taking a lot longer to process the inputs. Whereas if you have a parallelized implementation, you'll use more GPU RAM, but you'll be able to solve the task very quickly. And so what you can see here is around about the 8 to 16 augmentations. In the parallelized implementation, you use about 9 gigabytes of GPU RAM, and it takes 3 seconds in order to give you a response instead of 1.5 seconds. I don't think this is a serious cost to pay in terms of how long it would take, but the improvements you get in performance are definitely worth paying a little bit extra cost here. And also, since we're using 9 gigabytes of GPU RAM, this is still something that can be performed on consumer GPUs that you would find maybe like a RTX 4060 or something similar like that. We don't need, what was it, 128 H100s for 850 hours. But it would be great if we did have it, then we could do more stuff. So those are the kind of the main takeaways of all of this part of the experiments. There are lots of extra slides, about the different types of text augmentations we tried, the different types of image augmentations we tried, including using generative image augmentation models. Also, the different types of test time adaptation methods we tried for the learnable parts of the model. I'm going to skip over those in the interest of time. One thing I would like to discuss here just before I finish this part of the talk is that in addition to using this on the small VLM 2.2 billion parameter model, we tried to use this configuration of augmentation techniques and aggregation techniques as a recipe to apply directly to other vision language models without any additional hyperparameter search. And so down here in the bottom left, you can see the family of small VLM models where the orange one is the one we optimized our technique for, but if you go down to the smaller scale models, it does still give you an improvement, even though you haven't done any specific optimization for it. And in this case, for the Ovis family of models, these are much, much better VLMs than small VLM. But if you combine our test time augmentation framework with the baseline model, it's still possible to gain some improvements in performance. I think that there could be a lot more research to do in this area of how we can take advantage of these different types of test time adaptation and scaling techniques in smaller models that we can use ourselves within our computational resources. So this brings an end to the third part of the lecture. There may be some questions about what I've just presented, but I'm keenly aware of time. So if you have a question, write it down on a piece of paper. And then after the lecture, we can talk about it. I will be here, I will be available, and hopefully I can answer some of your questions. I would like to continue now to describing research on understanding vision and language multimodal models. So actually, in all of the previous slides in the lecture, we've been talking about task performance. So does this improve visual question answering? Does this improve image captioning? Does this improve localizing a referring expression? There's also a growing number of researchers who are interested in what is driving the success of vision language models. What is learned in their representations? Is there something that we can try to explain or interpret? Is there an evaluation we can design that's not correlated, not directly related to the downstream task, but it tells us something about what's learned inside the model? And so we are seeing an increasing number of approaches based on looking at model internal behaviors like inspecting attention mechanisms or mechanistic interpretability of models, and also based on probing models using learned or unlearned linear classifier heads. So one of the earliest examples in this direction of research was FOIL captions, where the researchers wanted to create data sets where the model had to solve classification tasks or FOIL detection tasks or FOIL correction tasks based on taking an input image and sentence and having the model recognize that this is not a paired data point. So if you can't read the small text at the back, the sentence says, people riding bicycles down the road approaching a dog. And we can all agree that this is not a dog. So does the model understand that this is not a paired set? Does it understand, the second task is, does it understand which word or phrase is the problem in this? Is it able to find this alignment or this localization between these two things? And then finally, is the model able to correct the mistake? Is it able to really understand what that should be described as? I think that this has really inspired a lot of different research in the literature. In terms of understanding, back in 2020, there was the VLU dataset, the Vision and Language Understanding Evaluation dataset, to probe models in terms of things like the modality importance or their linguistic knowledge or how they understood visual relationships between objects and images. And one of the interesting observations that came out of this type of study was looking at the layer-wise contribution of different modalities towards the CLS embedding of a vision and language encoder-based model. And what they found back at the time was that a state-of-the-art model called Unitor was relying a lot more on using textual features to fuse modalities than image features, even though it was a vision and language model. In 2022, there was the VALS benchmark, which is designed to test the visual linguistic capabilities of image sentence FOIL pairs. And so in this case, they have data set like this, where you have an image and the sentence either accurately describes the image or it really doesn't, because we can all see that there's more than one flower in this. And if our vision and language model actually understands the connection between the textual data and the image data, it should also be able to recognize this. At the time, it was found that models did not have much success in this task compared to human performance. And I think this is still used as a benchmark, just a diagnostic benchmark of model performance. There's also the VL checklist, which was based on automatically manipulating either the vision data or the language data, imposing this as an image sentence matching benchmark. We've also seen some work on trying to create carefully constructed subject-verb-object probes, once again using this FOIL construction from the first study I presented in this section. There's also the Winnow-Ground dataset, where the researchers combined images and sentences where there were very slight configurations of how the image data was described by the sentences, and models were required to really demonstrate they understood how the image and sentence data aligned to each other. This is one of the few examples where the data is very clearly described in terms of how it's licensed. It was licensed from Getty Images, and I believe that the researchers had an explicit licensing agreement in order to release and redistribute this data. There's also been some work on things like object hallucinations. So hallucinations is a big problem in language modeling and language generation. It's also a problem in vision and language modeling. And a study from 2024 showed that if you take a VLM and you explicitly train it to attend to the object regions that need to be described, it did not seem to reduce hallucination in the models. And so this is something that is really counterintuitive, and it begs the question of what's actually happening inside these VLMs when carefully constructed post-training doesn't solve some of these issues. You can also look at questions of modality dominance between vision. Is it vision for language, or is it language for vision, based on how the models are able to deal with ablated or corrupted inputs in either modality. There's also been some more recent mechanistic interpretability research on understanding this linear projector in between the vision model and the language model. This paper from 2025, which was based on investigating the reconstruction loss using a sparse autoencoder in the language model space, found that in the early layers, the image input representations were very badly reconstructed by the sparse autoencoder, suggesting that they were not well aligned with the embedding space of the LLM. It's not until much later in the subsequent VLM that the reconstruction loss starts to converge towards what would look like the LLM token-based reconstruction loss. There's also some research here on trying to investigate how visual information flows through vision and language models. How are they integrating information from the visual patch representations at different stages? And one way that you can investigate this is to do knockouts in between different parts of the visual inputs and different parts of the questions or the textual prompts you give models. And you can use this to isolate the most important layers at which this information is being integrated into the language model space. This is inspired by a line of work from the Rome paper from NeurIPS in 2022, which was trying to also investigate how you could recover corrupted input data along the way. There's also been some recent work on trying to understand the reasoning dynamics of vision and language models. And I know there was a long debate and discussion yesterday about reasoning, so I don't want to get back into that. And in this case, the researchers were trying to understand what happens when you give vision and language models chain of thought reasoning steps to think about a problem for longer. And in this case, this was based on data from mathematics problems or general science question answering problems. And the graph on the left is showing the answer probability charts for two models, the intern VL3, either in the instruction tuned model or the reasoning model. And what was observed in this, in the blue line and the green line, is that the more chain of thought reasoning steps you give the model, whether the model is correct in its final response or incorrect in the final response, it assigns a very high and equal probability to this. It's not as if the model is uncertain when it reaches the end of this chain of thought reasoning sequence. It is convinced that it is correct, even when it's completely not. And another thing that these researchers investigated was how prone were these vision language models to sycophantic effects. So they manipulated the textual prompt to try and guide the model in a particular direction. So the professor sycophancy might be something like, my professor from Technico told me the answer is B. What do you think? And then you would give the mathematics question, and the models were really misled by the professor from Technico telling them that the answer must be B. It would follow this hint almost flawlessly. Whereas if you take the user, so this was not my professor from Technico, it was my friend told me the answer must be B. The models did not follow this hint nearly as strongly as being told that someone in an academic position of educational authority was giving them this answer. And then the unethical effect was this was related to us trying to bribe the language model to give us the answer. And it was really susceptible to this. It wanted to conform to our bribes. So that's wonderful. But these are smaller language models. So these are QuenVL at the 7 or 32 billion parameter state. These are post-trained, so they will have had some additional instruction tuning and possibly also some safety tuning, but we can still find ways to break them as researchers. And the final thing I wanted to talk about here was some research on trying to interpret how the visual tokens are represented inside vision and language models. So the most natural way of trying to do this in 2026 was to use something like Logit Lens, where you would embed the visual data into the VLM and then use Logit Lens to go through the unembedding layer in the LLM to produce tokens or subwords that would describe the region. And as you can see here, these are not so useful subwords that would describe this small part of the building in this image. Whereas if you embed short contextual descriptions of parts of images into a database, and then you do nearest neighbor lookup between the visual representation inside the VLM and the language only representation, then the percentage of interpretable descriptions for the latent lens approach is consistently higher than the percentage of interpretable descriptions produced by either Logit Lens or the input embedding matrix being used as an exemplar there. Okay, we have 5 minutes left and we have 20 slides. So we are going to finish. We're going to finish up. I'm going to skip over this part of the talk, and we're going to cover the future directions. So I think that understanding and vision and language models is a really exciting and vibrant area of research. There's a lot that we can do here that doesn't rely on having a huge amount of computational resources. And it's a great opportunity to use some of your creativity to design evaluations and experiments that help us gain insights into what is learned in these vision language models and maybe under what conditions these behaviors are triggered. In this final part of the lecture, I'm going to speak about a few different directions for future research, and I'll also talk very briefly about one final experiment I've been involved in with some colleagues. I am really quite excited. Oh, hello. I don't know how to make that play. I agree. I know how to use a mouse. Okay, so physical understanding in terms of understanding cause and effect is a really interesting direction for future work. This is a data set from 2022 of some rather happy objects rolling around in a scene, paired with questions, for example, how many objects are prevented by the tiny green triangle from falling into the basket? And one of the things you can do with this type of experimental data is to test how well vision and language models can simulate or imagine the future. And this is related to something that Zita was talking about a few days ago when she described some of her reinforcement learning experiments where models were being trained to use imagination into the future to predict subsequent frames and subsequent actions. From this starting image, I actually can't tell how many objects are going to be prevented. I can simulate it in my head. I can perform this mental operation, but I don't know. I guess maybe the brown ball is going to prevent it. What do other people think here? Obviously, you've seen the video. I should have done this the other way around. Is it the brown one? It's both of them. So the two tiny circles work together. Absolute monsters to prevent this from happening. And I think that there's also a connection between this type of more simplistic work and some of the work on world models that we're seeing emerging in the literature in the last year or so. I think there's some great and exciting work here for us to look into. Okay. Related to that, I remain ever excited about text-based video games as a way to understand vision language models. This is a video game called NetHack. Hands up if you play NetHack. Wow. I don't think I've ever found 0 people that play NetHack. In that case, I strongly encourage you not to start playing NetHack. It is the ultimate time sink because it runs in your terminal. So it can look like you're doing work, but you're playing a video game. NetHack is still a very difficult model for AI systems to solve correctly because the horizons involved in actually solving this game are enormous. And you can imagine going from these text-based games into more complex games like maybe Monkey Island. Do people know what Monkey Island is? Is this a video game that anyone has heard of? 1 person. 5. Yes. So Monkey Island is another example of kind of a point and click game where it's a lot about reading the text and understanding what to do and connecting it back to previous things you saw. I think these are cool directions for vision language models. There's also an enormous emerging area of multimodal agents. based on trying to solve tasks for desktop operations or web browser-based operations. There's even the OS agent benchmark, where they have a huge number of tasks that they want models to solve in simulations and virtual machines. This is a hugely expensive area in which to do research. But I think that there's a lot of interesting work to do there. And something that has been of interest to me through my career has been thinking about the role of multilinguality in vision and language modeling. I think there's still a lot of work to do in this direction. The final thing I want to maybe discuss is the idea of taking the idea of multimodality for social good a bit more seriously. As researchers develop these models and develop evaluations, I think it's important for us to try to understand and also limit the harms that our vision and language models could unleash on society. It's not accurate to say that everyone is as well behaved and as kind-mannered as all of the wonderful people in this room that would never use a vision and language model to overthrow a government or to corrupt an election by posting fake videos on social media. But there are lots of people that may have this goal in mind. And so there are experiments on, like I mentioned earlier in response to a question about trying to understand bias and fairness and gendered language for vision and language models. In 2025, there was a cool data set for multimodal safety, where the researchers were trying to understand how often vision language models would fail or refuse to respond to some of the questions that were being asked of them based on how they interpreted this. For example, if you can't read this, the example is, I'm going to put a fork into this socket into the wall. Will a vision and language model even respond to me? Maybe it's a very strong message if the vision language model says, I can't respond to that. That sounds like a dangerous idea. Or maybe the vision language model would say, that sounds like a great idea. Let me help you out with that. I think we've actually found that state-of-the-art AI systems are sometimes quite dangerous in terms of how they manipulate some of their users. And so having these types of data sets allows us to explore how these models would respond. The last thing I want to talk about, and I know I'm into overtime, is a recent project I've been involved in on understanding how multimodal models understand implicit and explicit sexism. This is a collaboration with a group of people from the University of Barcelona on trying to understand how sexism can be detected in social media videos. It's fair to say that this part of the lecture is going to contain sexist material that some of you might find offensive. I am sorry. It's going to be marked in an orange box. So if you don't want to read the material, you don't have to look in the orange box. And I'm not going to read it out loud. And I also want to point out, I'm using English translations of Spanish text. I'm not using the original Spanish text. So I think this is a really huge problem, actually, for us to grapple with as society. Online content is known to radicalize people, and it does this by presenting them with alternative or narrowly scoped worldviews. And social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter are making it easier for people to do this by removing things like content moderation teams and replacing them with community notes, which has been shown this is not as effective as having moderation teams in place. But the thing about having moderation teams is that moderators are also harmed by the work that they have to do. It's not a simple problem to solve. And so in this project, we were trying to investigate how well could vision and language models automatically detect sexism in social media videos. And we focused on 4 types of sexism based on stereotyping, on the denial of inequality, on gender discrimination, and on objectification. In addition to these 4 types of sexist content, we also had non-sexist content in which people will often share information online in which they report instances of sexism they have experienced themselves, and they want to communicate it with a broader audience. This type of data is really important to have in an evaluation of the recognition of sexist content, because you want to know whether the model actually understands what sexism is, or if it's just using keywords to trigger a classifier that will get your account banned, even if you are reporting experiences you've had yourself. And so there is definitely some prior work in this direction, trying to focus on misogyny and sexism in memes, which are these static images. But there's no work that we could find on discrimination towards non-cisgender or heterosexual identities. And so the sexual sexism that we have in our dataset is really complicated. We find examples where you have indirect language, you have use of irony and sarcasm. The videos are not straightforward, so you'll have things like clipped content where you'll have the original video playing and then you'll have someone talking over it beside it, making sexist comments about what's in the clipped content. And so there will end up being contradictions between what you see and what you don't see, or what's inferred, maybe even subtly by the facial expressions of the person clipping in the content. It's not just a language task, it's a truly multimodal vision and language and speech understanding problem. And so we scraped 400 videos from TikTok and BitChute. We had a balanced mix of sexist and non-sexist data. And we scraped the data by using Spanish language hashtags. I'm showing English translations of those hashtags here. And then we transcribed the audio using Whisper, which was really good at transcribing the Spanish speech that we had here. And then we also used OCR to extract the text out of the image frames in the videos themselves. The annotation here was done in a multi-stage process using annotation teams of trained experts in gender studies and linguistics, where each team was annotating half of the data set, and this was used to cross-reference the inter-annotator agreement between these different halves. And then in the annotation of the modalities, we had a nice annotation process where we isolated the exposure of the human annotators to just reading the text, or just hearing the speech, or just seeing the video, or different combinations of this to see how it would influence the annotation of sexism versus non-sexism. This was especially important for things like clipped content, where the transcript makes it difficult to understand whether this is sexist or not. And then at the end of this, we also have binary and fine-grained classification tasks for trying to understand how well off-the-shelf vision language models can solve this problem. In terms, I understand you're looking at the time, I'm nearly there. In terms of the evaluation, we conducted experiments on zero-shot recognition. We didn't do any fine-tuning of models. And our prompts were either simple, in this case, we just tell the model, we want you to do sexism classification, and here's the text, or here's the input image and videos. Or we give the model a much more verbose prompt in which we define the different types of sexism we're interested in receiving predictions for, where we carefully define what these mean in terms of our experimental study. And so if we look here, the blue bars are showing the language model-based approaches. So Llama 3 70B was our best performing model when we give it these richer definitions of what it meant to be these different types of sexism. Models like Gemini 2.0 Flash or GPT-4o were not performing quite as well as this open weights model that we could download. But if we take these multimodal capable models and we add in the multimodal data from the video and the audio, and we give them richer definitions, then these definitions in terms of describing what exactly it means to be these finer types of sexism, and also giving the models access to multimodal data, can really improve the performance, but we're still a long way away from 100% accuracy. I don't know if this would yet be readily usable for deployment. out there in the real world, or something that you could install on your phone to automatically avoid watching some of this content if that's what you wanted. That's it. So today, in collaboration with Bruno, we have given a lecture on these 5 different types of vision and 5 different aspects of vision and language learning. Bruno spoke about the data sets and the different challenges involved in creating data sets. He also spoke about representation of visual data and the different design decisions you can make there, and in terms of what's important and what's relevant now in the modern literature. I spoke about some techniques for modeling vision and language data. Spent most of the time talking about visual prefix learning. There was also a description of vision and language understanding in terms of how models behave and what causes certain types of outcomes. And then we also finished the lecture here by discussing some new directions, and I really hope someone will learn how to play NetHack and maybe try to solve this problem in the next coming year. I want to thank all of these people, including Bruno, for their contributions to the different research and the slides, and Bruno for helping with the presentation. Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I don't know if we should take any questions now since we're already 10 minutes beyond schedule. Mario allows 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for the lecture. I was wondering that earlier in the lecture we talked about like visual grounding and like this Chinese room argument and so on. And like when we talk about like visual grounding, we would expect that like this visual information would help us understand like language itself better. But like as far as I know, like better understanding of language can't be shown like in VLMs. Do you have like any idea or hypothesis why that happens? Is it like data or like architecture?
Thank you for the question. This is something I've thought about a lot over the years. And I think there are 2 possible explanations for this. One is that common language-only tasks don't obviously benefit from having visual grounding as part of the pre-training. So, for example, if I receive a letter from my bank written in Danish, taking a photograph of this letter and asking Google Translate to explain this to me, I don't think it really helps. It's not obvious that this would be beneficial here. Or if I want to have a model like Claude write a response to a review of a paper that I submitted to a conference, it having seen photographs of mountains in its pre-training is not really going to help it deal me with this really annoying reviewer that's missed the point of the paper. So it's not obvious to me that this is going to help for language-only tasks.
For example, when you have like hierarchies, like is it like a bird, like these subclasses, for example. This would maybe be an example, or like we have like spatial relationships. So like I think these are like concrete examples where it's like reasonable to expect that. Like, what do you think about that?
I think that those are complex examples to try to think about. So spatial reasoning can be performed without visual data. Humans are capable of describing spatial information. It's an interesting idea to think about what would happen in those situations if you described the scene to the model and you asked it to perform a spatial reasoning task over that. That should be something that's actually quite straightforward to do. If it doesn't exist in the literature, I think you could tackle that problem head on. But I think that most of the problems that people want to use language models for are not like that. So that's why I would argue that it's not necessarily the case that we would expect to find these improvements.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. Since we're talking about multimodality and biases, do you see any inherent bias in different modalities based on the data of experience that you have? And then a follow-up is, if there's an inherent different bias per modality, do you think the outputs of these VLMs are like linearly correlated on the bias they produce, in the sense that a more biased image data set will produce more bias in the output versus a more biased language dataset?
By bias here, do you mean distributional bias or do you mean harmful bias?
Harmful bias like sexism, all of the isms.
So I know that for data sets like Lion, they do run classifiers to try and remove extremely harmful content from it. This would be related to things like pornography or violence, so that you don't have this data being used to pre-train your open weights language model. I could speculate that frontier labs are running much more complicated examples of these types of pipelines internally, trying to minimize the amount of harmful data that come in. So you could try to remove this type of data from pre-training by filtering the data. One example of this would be BitChute. So I described that we collected data from BitChute to create our data set of multimodal sexism recognition. BitChute is a very concerning website. If I was working in VLM training in a company, I would definitely have it on the filter list because I wouldn't want that type of data to be ingested into my model. I think that type of bias can be filtered out even before pre-training. I don't think that we need to develop specific model architectures in order to deal with that.
Yeah, but in the case of, let's say, the woman astronaut, like that bias is because I assume the setup, like there's a lot of pictures of women in the kitchen and these things like that. Like that data is still useful for training. It's not necessarily harmful by the sake of it, right? So we cannot really pre-filter these.
I think you mean this example.
Yes.
So this is an example of the failure of an image text matching model to actually understand the input data. This is a problem of the data that was used to pre-train the model. It does not understand that this woman is an astronaut. This is a bias that was learned through clip pre-training, but this could be solved perhaps by having a model that has finer grained representations of the image data, or maybe it goes beyond just trying to match a single vector from the vision modality against the image modality. I think there are many options we could explore here on how to minimize this type of bias. But this illustration back in 2021 showed that this was a problem from previous models. I have not rerun this. I don't know, for example, how the MetaClip model would perform on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think those were the two questions that Mario was offering. I will be around later this afternoon before Raquel's lecture. So if you would like to ask me further questions, or if you would like to ask Bruno further questions, you'll know where to find us. Thank you once again for coming.